Picture a world without books or written records, where the wisdom of an entire civilization is entrusted not to parchment, but to memory, passed down through generations by a revered class of philosopher priests. This was the world of the Druids, the intellectual and spiritual elite of the ancient Celtic peoples. For centuries, they have existed in our collective imagination as enigmatic figures cloaked in white robes, their true nature obscured by the mists of time and the biased accounts of the Romans who ultimately conquered their lands. We know of them only through the words of their adversaries, through the writings of men like Julius Caesar, who described them as powerful judges, teachers, and masters of natural philosophy, yet also painted them as practitioners of barbaric rites. This one-sided history leaves us with a haunting central question. What profound knowledge, what deep understanding of the world was lost when their oral traditions were silenced? Their entire cosmological framework, their intricate laws, their medicinal secrets, and their celestial observations, an entire library of thought vanished, leaving behind only enigmatic stone circles and whispers in the old myths. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a genuine intellectual black hole, a missing chapter in the story of human knowledge that calls out for exploration. We are about to embark on a journey to decode the ancient code of the Druids, to peer through the veil of 2,000 years and piece together the fragments of their lost wisdom. We will walk in their sacred groves, trace the alignments of their mysterious monuments with the movements of the sun and stars, and delve into the symbolism of their rituals that bound the community to the very cycles of the earth itself. This is more than an archaeology lesson. It is a quest to understand a different way of seeing the universe, one where every oak tree held a spirit, every river had a voice, and the sky was a great turning wheel of meaning. Prepare to uncover the secrets they guarded so closely, to explore the possibility that these ancient wise men possessed an understanding of nature, astronomy, and the human spirit that we are only now beginning to rediscover with our modern science. The journey into the heart of this ancient mystery starts now. To truly understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first meet the Druids themselves, not as shadowy figures of myth, but as the multifaceted pillars of an entire civilization. In the Celtic world, which stretched from the British Isles deep into mainland Europe, the Druid was far more than a simple priest. Imagine a single individual who combined the roles of a Supreme Court justice, a university professor, a skilled physician, a master astronomer mapping the heavens, and a revered philosopher contemplating the nature of existence. This was the Druid. They were the intellectual and spiritual engine of their people, the living repositories of all law, history, science, and sacred tradition. Their authority was not derived from political power or military might, but from their profound and hard-won knowledge, a wisdom so respected that it was said a single Druid could step between two armies on the verge of clashing and command peace, a command that was obeyed without question. This immense power was earned through a grueling intellectual apprenticeship. According to classical sources, aspiring Druids underwent a training period that could last up to 20 years. They did not learn from scrolls or books, but through an intense oral tradition, memorizing an immense body of knowledge in verse. They committed to memory the complete histories of their people, the complex genealogies of the tribes, the intricacies of a sophisticated legal system, and the vast pharmacopoeia of medicinal plants. They learned to read the portents in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrifices, and they mastered the complex motions of the celestial bodies, allowing them to create precise calendars that governed agricultural and religious life. Their philosophical beliefs were profound and shaped their entire worldview. They held as a core tenet the doctrine of the soul's immortality and its transmigration through different lives, a concept that classical writers noted was strikingly similar to the teachings of the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. They believed that death was merely a pause, a transition to another form of life, which likely informed their famed bravery in battle and their reported lack of fear when facing the end. This belief in an endless cycle of existence connected all living things in a sacred web, a concept that infused their role as judges, healers, and mediators. As judges, they presided over both public and private disputes, delivering verdicts that were considered final and binding. As healers, they blended practical herbal knowledge with spiritual rites, seeing illness as an imbalance within the individual and their environment. As astronomers, their observations were not mere academic exercise. They were essential for determining the timing of sacred festivals like Samhain and Beltane, events that marked the turning of the year and bound the community to the eternal rhythms of the earth and sky. The visual legacy we have of them is scant, filtered through the art of the Celts themselves, which favored intricate, swirling, abstract patterns, and the more literal and often propagandistic sculptures of their Roman conquerors who sought to depict them as barbaric figures to justify their subjugation. Yet even these biased sources cannot completely mask their dignified and revered stature. They were the keepers of the ancient code, a code not written in stone but etched into memory, a living, breathing system of wisdom that held a vibrant, warrior-based society together for centuries. This profound reliance on memory, this deliberate rejection of the written word, is the very source of the great mystery that surrounds them and presents us with our greatest challenge. The Druids believed their sacred knowledge was too powerful, too alive to be frozen on a dead page. They saw writing as a crutch that would weaken the formidable power of memory and, more importantly, risked profaning their wisdom by allowing it to fall into the wrong hands. This was not a primitive choice but a philosophical one. They understood that true understanding is passed from mind to mind, through years of mentorship, through poetry and song that carries layers of meaning impossible to capture in simple text. The knowledge was a living thing, constantly refined and reinterpreted by each generation, and to write it down would be to kill its spirit, to make it static and lifeless. This oral tradition created a direct, unbroken chain of wisdom, but it was a chain that could be shattered with devastating finality, and that is precisely what happened. With no written records of their own, we are forced to view the Druids through a distorted lens, through the writings of their conquerors. The most significant of these sources is Julius Caesar, who encountered the Druids during his Gallic Wars. In his commentaries, he provides some of our most detailed descriptions, acknowledging their immense intellectual authority and their role as judges and teachers. Yet we must never forget that Caesar was writing for a specific political purpose, to justify his brutal military campaigns to the Roman Senate and people back home. He had a vested interest in portraying the Celtic peoples as both sophisticated enough to be a worthy conquest, but also as barbaric enough to deserve subjugation. So, alongside his descriptions of their philosophical debates, he emphasizes their practice of human sacrifice, painting vivid and horrifying pictures of wicker men filled with living victims set ablaze to appease the gods. How much of this is accurate reporting, and how much is propaganda designed to shock a Roman audience and legitimize his war? Other Roman writers add their own layers of bias. The naturalist Pliny the Elder describes the Druids with a mix of fascination and disdain, focusing on their rituals involving the harvesting of mistletoe with a golden sickle and their veneration of the oak tree. His account leans into the exotic and the mystical, shaping the image of the Druid as a nature-worshipping magician, an image that would later be romanticized for centuries. The historian Tacitus, writing about the Roman invasion of the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, describes the Druids as fanatical figures shrieking curses at the Roman legions, surrounded by screaming women waving torches. This was a dramatic scene meant to highlight the barbaric superstition the Romans were stamping out, a narrative of civilized Rome bringing order to chaotic and savage lands. The central problem is that these Roman authors never aimed for objective ethnography. They were men of their own culture, looking upon a foreign people with a sense of superiority. They selectively reported what confirmed their own biases about barbarism and what seemed impressive or strange to a Roman sensibility. They likely misunderstood or deliberately sensationalized complex rituals. A symbolic effigy might become a literal wicker man of death. A spiritual chant might become a blood-curdling curse. We are left trying to reconstruct a symphony from a handful of discordant notes played by its critics. The true voice of the Druids, the nuance of their philosophy, the subtlety of their laws, and the depth of their connection to the natural world remains just beyond our grasp, a ghost in the historical record, defined more by what is missing than by what remains. Given the immense challenge of relying on hostile Roman accounts, how can we ever hope to hear the true voice of the Druids? The answer may not lie in written words at all, but in the very landscape they held sacred. For the Druids, divinity was not confined to man-made structures. Their entire temple was the living, breathing world around them. They saw the divine in the towering oak, the bubbling spring, and the quiet mist of a riverbank at dawn. To understand their philosophy, we must step away from the pages of Roman history and walk directly into their sacred groves, to places they called nemetons. A nemeton was not merely a cluster of trees, it was a consecrated space, a sanctuary of ancient oak and ash, deliberately set apart from the mundane world. Entering one was to cross a threshold into a realm of profound spiritual power. The oak tree itself was central to this experience. It was seen as a cosmic axis, its roots delving deep into the underworld and its branches reaching high into the heavens, physically connecting the three realms of existence. The rustle of its leaves was believed to be the voice of the gods, a sacred language the Druids alone could interpret. These groves were the primary settings for their most important ceremonies, from judicial proceedings and philosophical teachings to seasonal celebrations that honored the turning of the year. Beyond the forest, water held an equally potent spiritual significance. Sacred wells and springs were revered as portals to the otherworld, places where the veil between the realms was exceptionally thin. These were not just sources of water, they were seen as the lifeblood of the earth itself, gifting healing, wisdom, and prophecy. Offerings of precious objects, from finely crafted metalwork to simple carved tokens, were cast into these pools as gifts to the deities that resided within. This practice gives us some of our most tangible archaeological evidence of their beliefs, as many of these hoards have been recovered, perfectly preserved in the peat and mud, silent testimonies to centuries of devotion. Similarly, riverbanks and coastlines, those liminal spaces where land meets water, were charged with spiritual energy. These transitional zones mirrored the Druidic belief in cycles and thresholds, places of neither here nor there, where communication with the otherworld was most accessible. The choice of these locations was never arbitrary. It was a sophisticated act of sacred geography, an understanding that certain places on the earth held a unique and powerful resonance. They sought out locations with distinctive natural features, a peculiarly shaped hill, a striking confluence of rivers, a grove of unusually ancient trees. These places were believed to be nodes of terrestrial energy, points where the power of the land was concentrated and could be tapped into by those who knew the rites. This deep connection to specific places in the landscape stands in stark contrast to the Roman approach, which was to impose order upon nature, to clear land and build uniform stone temples dedicated to specific anthropomorphized gods. The Druidic worldview was one of integration and reverence, not domination. They listened to the land and learned from it, seeing themselves as part of a vast, animate cosmos where every mountain, stream, and tree possessed a spirit. This philosophy of an interconnected, living earth, where humanity is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of life, is perhaps their most enduring and timely legacy, a concept that resonates deeply with our modern understanding of ecology and the delicate balance of our natural world. But this sacred relationship with the landscape went even deeper. crystallizing into a sophisticated language and system of knowledge rooted, quite literally, in the trees themselves. For the Druids, the forest was not just a temple, it was a library, a pharmacy, and a calendar, all encoded in the bark and branches of the native species they revered. This profound arboreal wisdom is most famously preserved in the Ogham script, an ancient alphabet that is far more than a mere writing system. It is a direct transcript of the Druidic worldview. Imagine an alphabet where every single letter is named for a different tree or plant, where the characters themselves look like a series of straight lines and notches carved directly into the edge of a standing stone or a piece of wood, resembling the branching pattern of a tree against the sky. This is Ogham. The first letter, Beeth, is the birch tree, a symbol of new beginnings and purification, used to drive out negative energies. Lewis is the rowan, revered as a tree of protection and enchantment, often planted near dwellings to ward off evil. Fern is the alder, associated with strength, resurrection, and the art of dying, its wood yielding a vibrant red hue. Each of these 20 original characters, or feda, carries with it a wealth of symbolic meaning, medicinal use, and spiritual significance, creating a complex code where nature and language were utterly inseparable. This wasn't merely a poetic device, it was a functional, living system of knowledge. A druid walking through a forest would have seen not just a collection of trees, but a walking encyclopedia of lore, magic, and practical science. The oak, or dur, from which the word druid itself is thought to be derived, was the king of the forest. It represented strength, stability, and doorway. Dur is the etymological root of door, signifying an entryway to higher wisdom and other realms. Its wood was used for sacred fires, and its acorns could be ground for flour in times of need. The hazel col was the tree of wisdom and inspiration. Its nuts were believed to contain the salmon of knowledge, and hazel wands were used for divination and locating water. The yew ioho was a tree of profound duality, representing both death and eternity. Its incredible longevity and toxic, yet medicinal, properties made it a powerful symbol of the soul's journey, and it was often planted in sacred groves and cemeteries. This intricate knowledge extended into a comprehensive understanding of herbal medicine. The Druidic healer would have known that willow bark from sale could ease pain and reduce fever, a property we now know comes from salicin, the natural precursor to aspirin. They would have used the astringent properties of blackthorn, strafe, and understood the calming effects of chamomile. Their botanical wisdom was a deep, empirical science passed down through generations, a science where every plant had both a physical and a spiritual application. This cyclical, arboreal understanding of time was so complete that many scholars believe it was formalized into what is often called the Celtic tree calendar, a 13-month lunar calendar where each month was governed by a specific tree. This system wove the passing seasons directly into the life cycles of the forest. The year might begin with the birch moon in December, a time for introspection and cleansing, clearing the slate for the new cycle to come. This would be followed by the rowan moon in January, a period for setting protections for the year ahead. The calendar progressed through the vibrant growth of the alder and willow months in spring, the mighty oak moon at the summer solstice, and the fruitful hazel moon in the autumn, finally culminating in the elder moon, a time for endings and completion before the cycle began anew with the birch. This wasn't an abstract way of marking days, it was a practical guide for living. It dictated when to plant and when to harvest, when to hold court and when to perform specific rituals, aligning every aspect of human life with the pulse of the natural world. The law, or Brehon law, that the Druids upheld was also infused with this arboreal symbolism. Certain trees were classified as nobles or commoners, and the penalties for unlawfully cutting them down were severe, reflecting their importance to the community's spiritual and physical welfare. To harm a sacred oak was not just a crime against a person, it was a sacrilege against the cosmos itself. The Ogham script, then, was the key that unlocked this entire system. It was a mnemonic device for remembering vast amounts of information, a symbolic map of the cosmos, and a tool for divination. By studying the trees, their properties, and their cycles, a druid was not just learning botany, they were deciphering the very language of the gods, reading the living scripture of the natural world. Of all the rituals attributed to the Druids, none captures the imagination more powerfully than the singular ceremony of the mistletoe and the golden sickle, an event preserved for us in the writings of the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. He describes a scene of profound sanctity, a ritual that unfolds with meticulous precision. It begins with the careful observation of the heavens, for the Druids would only perform this rite on the 6th day of the moon, a moment when the lunar body is neither young nor old, but perfectly balanced in its waxing phase, its power growing but not yet full. On this auspicious day, they would proceed to an oak tree that held a rare and sacred guest, a growth of mistletoe thriving high in its branches. The Druids believed the oak, as the king of the forest, was chosen by the sky gods themselves, and when the mistletoe, a plant that grows without roots in the earth, appeared upon it, it was seen as a direct gift from the heavens, a divine manifestation, and a symbol of life enduring even in the dormant heart of winter. The ceremony itself was a spectacle of pure white and gold, colors chosen for their symbolic purity and connection to divinity. 2 white-robed bulls were brought to the site, their horns bound for the first time, representing untapped strength and potential sacrifice. The Druid priests, also clad in robes of spotless white to signify their ritual purity and their role as intermediaries with the celestial realm, would then gather beneath the great tree. The lead Druid would not simply climb the oak, he would ascend it with reverence, a human axis between the earth below and the sky above. In his hand, he carried not an iron blade, but a gleaming golden sickle. The choice of gold was critically important. Iron, the metal of war and everyday tools, was considered a corrupting base metal, unfit for harvesting something so sacred. Gold, however, was the metal of the sun, incorruptible and divine, the only substance worthy of severing this celestial plant from its earthly anchor. As the Druid reached the mistletoe, he would carefully cut it with the golden sickle, ensuring the precious plant never touched the profane ground. Below, other priests held out a white cloth to catch the falling sprigs, preserving their sanctity and capturing the potent essence they believed resided within. Interpreting the layers of meaning in this ritual is like peeling back the layers of an ancient onion, each one revealing a deeper truth about the Druidic worldview. On one level, the mistletoe, with its white pearl-like berries and its evergreen nature in the bare winter oak, was a powerful symbol of fertility and immortality. In the depth of the cold season, when all other plant life seemed dead, the mistletoe remained vibrant and full of life, a clear promise of the returning sun and the rebirth of spring. Its sticky white sap was visually reminiscent of semen, further strengthening its association with vitality and procreation. The ritual, therefore, was likely a potent act of sympathetic magic, a way to harness this life force and ensure its blessings for the community, their livestock, and their crops in the coming year. The potion they were said to make from the mistletoe, the All-Heal, was believed to cure sterility, act as an antidote to poisons, and grant protection from evil. But the meaning cuts even deeper. The mistletoe, being a parasite that draws its sustenance directly from the sap of its host, was seen as the very soul or spiritual essence of the oak tree itself, condensed into a tangible, harvestable form. By cutting it with a golden sickle at a specific astrological moment, the Druids were performing a spiritual operation, capturing the tree's numen, its animating life force at its peak potency. They weren't just collecting a plant, they were bottling the soul of the sacred oak, a soul gifted by the sky gods, to be used as the most powerful medicine and magical substance in their possession. This act perfectly encapsulates their core belief in an animate, interconnected cosmos where celestial timing, terrestrial power, and human ritual could be harmonized to draw down divine energy for the benefit of all. It was a supreme act of sacred science, a fusion of astronomy, botany, and theology into a single, breathtaking moment of communion with the divine. Yet for all their profound connection to the living forest and its cycles, the Druids were far more than just primitive tree worshippers. They were, in fact, master astronomers and mathematicians, operating on a scale of intellectual sophistication that we are only now fully appreciating. The ultimate proof of this lies not in a sacred grove, but in a remarkable archaeological find, the Coligny Calendar. Discovered in 1897 in Coligny, France, this fragmented bronze tablet is, without question, one of the most important artifacts ever recovered from the ancient Celtic world. It is a monumental clockwork of time, a complex lunisolar calendar that reconciles the cycles of the moon with the journey of the sun across the sky over a staggering 30-year period. This is not the crude tally of days one might associate with so-called barbarians. It is a precise, intricate, and beautiful system of timekeeping that stands as a testament to the Druids' deep understanding of celestial mechanics. When you look at the reassembled fragments of the Coligny Calendar, you are looking at a grid of time meticulously inscribed with a mix of Latin letters and Gaulish words. It is laid out across 16 vertical columns, each representing a 62-month cycle, with the entire system spanning 5 of these cycles to create its grand 30-year schema. The calendar operates on a foundational unit of months, but these are not our familiar solar months. They are strictly lunar, each beginning with the first visible crescent of the new moon. To keep these lunar months in sync with the solar year, a necessity for ensuring that seasonal festivals like Beltane and Samhain always occurred in the correct season, the Druidic timekeepers engineered an ingenious system of intercalary months. They inserted an extra month every 2.5 years, a mathematical adjustment that kept their lunar calendar perfectly aligned with the agricultural and ceremonial rhythms dictated by the sun. This lunisolar reconciliation was a conceptual leap achieved by only a handful of the most advanced ancient civilizations, and the fact that the Celts possessed this knowledge shatters any lingering stereotype of them as unsophisticated. But the calendar's sophistication extends far beyond its mathematical structure. Each month is divided into 2 halves, a bright half and a dark half, reflecting the waxing and waning of the moon, symbolizing the eternal dance of growth and decay, life and death. And etched throughout this temporal map are the abbreviations MAT and ANUM. These stand for mature, meaning good or lucky, and unmature, meaning unlucky or not good. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a formalized, cyclical view of existence where time itself was not a neutral, empty container, but was imbued with qualitative spiritual energy. Certain days were inherently auspicious for beginning new ventures, holding legal assemblies, or conducting marriages, while others were deemed inauspicious, better suited for rest, reflection, or avoiding important decisions. This reveals a worldview where human activity was meant to flow in harmony with the cosmic tides, not fight against them. The universe had a rhythm, and the wise person learned to move with its currents. The implications of the Coligny Calendar are profound. It forces us to completely re-evaluate the intellectual capacity of Druidic society. The creation and maintenance of such a calendar required generations of meticulous astronomical observation. It demanded the ability to recognize complex patterns, to perform advanced calculations, and to encode this knowledge into a durable, public format, even if its full interpretation was reserved for the learned elite. The very existence of this bronze tablet suggests a formalized, scholarly class dedicated to the science of time, a class we know as the Druids. It shows us that their role as astronomers was as vital as their role as judges or priests, for they were the ones who gave society its temporal order, its connection to the cosmos. This tangible artifact moves the Druids out of the shadowy realm of myth and Roman propaganda and into the clear light of history as true natural philosophers. They were not just chanting in forests, they were calculating, observing, and building a systematic understanding of the universe that was both scientifically advanced and spiritually profound, a synthesis of reason and reverence that we have largely lost in our modern age. This mastery of time, so elegantly captured in the bronze of the Coligny Calendar, was not merely an abstract intellectual pursuit. It was a knowledge physically etched into the very landscape, encoded in stone monuments that reached for the heavens. While the Druids themselves did not build the grandest of these structures like Stonehenge, which was already ancient by their time, there is compelling evidence that they were the inheritors and active users of these sacred sites, the learned caste who understood and preserved the astronomical wisdom held within their towering stones. To stand at the center of Stonehenge on the morning of the summer solstice is to participate in a drama thousands of years in the making. As the sun crests the horizon, its rays shoot directly through the heart of the monument, perfectly aligned with the heel stone and illuminating the central altar. This was no accident. It was a precise, deliberate act of engineering, a permanent stone calendar marking the sun's northernmost sunrise, the pinnacle of its power. For an agricultural society, this moment was everything. It signaled the peak of the growing season, a time of maximum light and warmth, a critical turning point that governed planting, harvesting, and the survival of the community. The Druids, as the intellectual elite, would have been the ones to observe this event, to oversee the rituals that celebrated the sun's strength and petitioned the gods for a bountiful harvest. They were the living link between the cosmic clock and the human community, interpreting the messages written in the sky and enacting the ceremonies that kept their world in balance. But their astronomical vision extended far beyond the solar cycle. Consider Newgrange in Ireland, a massive kidney-shaped passage tomb older than both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. For 51 weeks of the year, its long, narrow passageway lies in deep, impenetrable darkness. Then, for just a few mornings around the winter solstice, as if by magic, a single, narrow beam of sunlight pierces a specially designed roof box above the entrance. This shaft of light travels down the 60-foot passage, creeping slowly across the floor until it dramatically illuminates the central chamber and the intricate spiral carvings on the back wall. This phenomenon is too precise, too perfectly engineered to be anything other than intentional. It represents a profound understanding of the solar cycle at the darkest time of the year. At the winter solstice, the sun is at its weakest, the days are at their shortest, and the world is gripped by cold. The illumination of the Newgrange tomb was a powerful symbolic act of defiance and hope. It was a reassurance that the sun had not been defeated, that the light would return, and that life would be reborn. This aligns perfectly with the Druidic belief in cycles of death and rebirth, the immortality of the soul, and the constant interaction between the world of the living and the other world, which was often associated with burial mounds like Newgrange. The light penetrating the tomb was a cosmic coupling, a divine impregnation of the earth womb with the seed of the sun, ensuring the cycle of life would begin anew. This cosmic awareness shaped their entire philosophical worldview, creating a sacred cosmology where the heavens and the earth were not separate realms, but intimately connected parts of a single living being. They saw the universe as a great interwoven tapestry. The orderly, predictable motions of the sun, moon, and stars represented the realm of the gods, a cosmic blueprint of harmony and law. The earth, with its chaotic seasons, its growth and decay, its storms and calms, was the manifestation of that blueprint. The Druids believed that by understanding the cosmic order above, they could bring order to the earthly realm below. Their astronomical observations were, therefore, a form of divine communion. By tracking the solstices and equinoxes, they were not just marking time, they were participating in the fundamental rhythms of creation, aligning their community's energy with the greater energy of the cosmos. This belief in a direct correspondence between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the human world is a concept found in many ancient wisdom traditions, but the Druids expressed it through their unique relationship with the land. A standing stone circle was a microcosm of the celestial order, its layout mirroring the perceived movements of the stars. A sacred oak was an axis mundi, its roots in the earthly realm and its branches in the heavenly one. Their rituals were acts of sacred synchronization designed to harness celestial power at its peak moments, like the summer solstice, to strengthen the community, protect the land, and ensure the fertility of crops and livestock. Their role was that of a cosmic conductor, ensuring the music of the spheres and the rhythm of the earth played in perfect, harmonious time. This intricate knowledge of alignments and cycles was the ultimate expression of their ancient code, a sophisticated science of spirit that saw no division between the movement of a star and the growth of a blade of grass, viewing all of existence as a single, sacred, and intelligently ordered whole. Within this sophisticated intellectual hierarchy, the Druids did not stand alone. They formed the pinnacle of a threefold learned class, a sacred trinity of knowledge that also included the Vates, who interpreted the divine through omens and sacrifices, and perhaps most accessibly for the common people, the bards. If the Druid was the supreme judge and philosopher, the bard was the living voice of the culture, the master of memory whose words could weave the very fabric of reality, command laughter, or topple a king with a single, sharp verse. These were not mere entertainers. They were the historians, genealogists, and social guardians of Celtic society, operating with a power we can scarcely comprehend today. Their training was as rigorous as that of the Druids, a grueling oral apprenticeship that could last for years, designed to forge their minds into perfect, unerring vessels for the collective memory of their people. A master bard was expected to commit to memory hundreds of epic poems, chronicling the histories of the clans, the heroic deeds of legendary warriors, and the complex genealogies that established land rights and political alliances. They memorized the entirety of the Brehon law codes, the intricate legal precedents that governed every aspect of life, from property disputes to contracts and personal injuries. This vast repository of information was not stored in dry, academic prose. It was encoded in complex, rhythmic, and alliterative verse, a poetic structure that acted as a powerful mnemonic device, locking the information into a form that was both beautiful and unforgettable. The ability to recall this knowledge verbatim, on demand, was not just a party trick, it was a vital social function. In a world without written public records, the bard was the walking library, the living database whose memory was the final authority in matters of law, history, and identity. This mastery of the spoken word granted the bard a power that went far beyond simple storytelling. It endowed them with a formidable social weapon known as glamdicin, often translated as the satire of extinction. In our modern world, a harsh review or a critical tweet might damage a reputation, but in the Celtic world, a bard's satire was believed to have tangible, physical consequences. It was understood as a form of magic, a curse woven from truth and poetic craft that could literally manifest on the body of its target. A king who was unjust, a chieftain who was miserly, or a hero who was cowardly could be subjected to a formal, ritualized satire composed by a bard. This was not simple mockery, it was a formal accusation, a public shaming that carried the weight of divine judgment. The belief was so powerful that a well-aimed satire could raise blisters on the face of the victim, cause them to break out in rashes, or even lead to their death from sheer shame and social ostracization. The community, bound by the power of this belief, would see the physical blemish as proof of the truth in the bard's words, and the disgraced leader could lose all authority, becoming an outcast. This power made the bard one of the most feared and respected figures in any chieftain's court. A wise ruler knew to keep a bard well-fed, well-honored, and close, for their tongue could either cement a legacy of glory or unravel a reign in a matter of verses. This practice reveals a profound cultural belief in the power of language itself, that words were not just sounds but active forces that could shape reality, enforce social justice, and maintain the moral order. The bard was the guardian of this power, the social conscience who held even the highest in the land accountable with nothing but the truth, artfully arranged. Beyond their role as historians and social satirists, bards were also seen as vessels for a more mystical, divine form of inspiration, a state known as imbasphorosnai, which translates to the light of foresight or encompassing knowledge that illuminates. This was not a skill that could be learned through rote memorization. It was a state of ecstatic, prophetic insight that had to be ritually induced. The process for achieving imbasphorosnai, as described in later Irish texts, was as strange as it was specific. A bard seeking this divine inspiration would first chew on a piece of the raw flesh of a red pig, a dog, or a cat, an act of symbolic communion with the animal world and its instinctual knowledge. Then they would offer this piece of meat to the gods of the other world. Next, the bard would retire to a dark, secluded space, often lying in a bed or wrapping their cloak around their head to shut out all sensory input from the physical world. In this state of sensory deprivation, they would chant a specific invocation, calling upon the gods to grant them a vision. They would remain in this trance-like state for up to 3 days and 3 nights, a period symbolic of a journey into the other world and back. On the 3rd night, if the ritual was successful, the imbasphorosnai would descend upon them. It was described as a brilliant light that illuminated the mind, allowing the bard to see the answers to any question, to know events that were happening at a great distance, or to foresee what was yet to come. Upon awakening, the bard would be able to compose a poem of such profound truth and beauty that it was understood to be a direct transmission from the divine, a prophecy or a revelation that could guide the tribe in times of crisis. This practice connects the Celtic bard to a universal shamanic tradition, where the artist acts as a conduit between the human and spirit worlds, sacrificing their ordinary consciousness to bring back a piece of the infinite for their people. It shows that their art was not merely a craft but a sacred vocation, a form of divine service where the greatest poems were not created but received. This threefold division of existence wasn't just a casual observation. It formed the very bedrock of the Druidic worldview, a sacred cosmology where the universe was understood as 3 interconnected realms in constant, dynamic conversation. At the foundation lay the land, the solid, tangible world of the living we walk upon every day. But for the Celts, the land was not an inert resource to be exploited. It was a living, breathing entity, a mother goddess teeming with spirit and power. This was the realm of the here and now, of forests and fields, of tribe and community, governed by the cycles of growth, harvest, and decay. It was the domain of the physical body, of agriculture, and of the complex laws that bound society together. The reverence for the land was absolute, for it was the source of all sustenance and the final resting place for the physical form. This profound connection is why the desecration of sacred land was considered one of the gravest offenses, a rupture in the very fabric of reality. Then there was the sea, but this concept extended far beyond the physical ocean. It represented all water, the churning sea, the flowing river, the still lake, and the hidden wellspring. Symbolically, the sea was the realm of the otherworld, the domain of the gods and the ancestors, a place of limitless potential and profound mystery that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. It was the Celtic equivalent of the subconscious mind, a deep, fluid, and often unpredictable reservoir of emotion, intuition, dreams, and prophecy. This is why so many of their myths involve journeys across water to miraculous islands like Avalon or Tir na and Og, lands of eternal youth and beauty that appear and disappear with the mist. The sea was the gateway to these realms, a threshold one crossed to gain wisdom, healing, or to commune with the departed. Its ever-changing, restless nature mirrored the flow of life force, the passage of time, and the emotional tides within every person. To stand at the shore was to stand at the edge of the known world, looking out into the vast, unknown possibilities of existence. Above it all arched the sky, the realm of the gods and celestial bodies. This was the domain of order, intellect, and divine law, manifested in the predictable, majestic movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The sky gods, like the Gaulish Tyrannes with his thunderous wheel, represented the immense, untamable power of the cosmos, the storm that brings both life-giving rain and destructive fury, the sun that nurtures and scorches, the stars that map out a grand celestial design. This realm was associated with the highest faculties of the human spirit, a reason, vision, and inspiration. It was from the sky that the divine spark of wisdom was believed to descend, and it was to the sky that the soul ultimately returned. The Druids, as master astronomers, saw the sky as a great turning clock and a sacred text, its patterns providing the blueprint for the order they sought to manifest on the land below. The interplay between the sky's order and the sea's chaos was the engine of creation itself. The true genius of this cosmology, however, lay in its profound interconnectedness. These three realms were not separate, stacked layers, but were constantly interpenetrating and influencing one another, held in a sacred, dynamic balance. The rain from the sky fell upon the land and fed the rivers that flowed to the sea. The mist from the sea rose to form the clouds in the sky. The roots of a great oak tree in the land drew water from the underground streams of the sea realm, while its branches reached up toward the celestial heights of the sky. A druid standing at a sacred site was acutely aware of this living triad. They felt the solidity of the land beneath their feet, heard the voice of the sea in a nearby spring, and observed the turning of the sky's wheel above their head. This holistic view meant that an imbalance in one realm would inevitably cause disruption in the others. A drought in the sky would lead to famine on the land and stagnation in the sea. Similarly, a moral corruption within the human community, a disruption in the land of society, was believed to upset the natural order, potentially angering the sky gods and causing turmoil in the environment. This pattern of three was so fundamental that it became a recurring motif, a sacred template applied to every aspect of their culture. We see it vividly embodied in their deities, who often appeared as triple beings. The Morrigan, for instance, was a triple goddess of sovereignty, war, and fate, often depicted as three sisters who could appear as a single woman or a trio of crones, maidens, or warriors. This was not just an artistic convention. It represented the multifaceted nature of divine power, its ability to act simultaneously in different realms or aspects, perhaps as a creator on the land, a prophetess in the sea of the subconscious, and a destroyer from the fury of the sky. This triadic principle was mirrored perfectly in the structure of their society, which was divided into three distinct, interdependent classes. The Druids themselves formed the first function, the intellectual and spiritual class connected to the order of the sky. They were the judges, the teachers, the philosophers who interpreted divine law. The warriors, the second function, were the defenders of the tribe, associated with the raw, untamed power and ferocity of the sea. Their role was to protect the community from chaos and invasion, much like the shore holds back the ocean. Finally, the producers, the farmers, artisans, and cattle herders were the foundation, firmly rooted in the land. They provided the material sustenance for all, their labor and fertility ensuring the physical survival of the tribe. Just as the three realms needed each other to form a complete cosmos, these three social classes were understood as equally vital, interdependent pillars holding up the entire structure of civilization. A kingdom could not thrive without the wisdom of the Druids, the strength of the warriors, and the productivity of the people. This sacred triad, from the grand scale of the cosmos down to the organization of a single village, reveals a culture that thought in terms of dynamic balance, relationship, and harmony, seeing the same fundamental pattern repeating from the highest heavens to the most humble human community. Yet beyond the solid land, the fluid sea, and the lofty sky, the Celtic imagination held space for a fourth, even more mysterious dimension, a realm that existed alongside our own, accessible yet hidden, a world of timeless perfection known as the Otherworld. This was not a gloomy underworld of punishment or a passive heaven for the departed. It was a vibrant, parallel reality, a place of breathtaking beauty, eternal youth, and ceaseless joy. In the Welsh traditions, it was called Anon, the very deep, a name that evokes a profound, foundational realm from which all life might spring. In the Irish myths, it was most famously known as Tir na an Og, the land of the young, an island far to the west across the sea, where sorrow, sickness, and old age were unknown, and the trees were always heavy with fruit. This was a realm of perpetual feasting, of divine music that could heal any wound, and of love that never faded. The heroes of the great epic cycles didn't journey there to die. They went to experience the fullness of life itself, to be tested, to gain wisdom, or to be reunited with lost loves. It was a destination for the living, a prize for the bravest and the most worthy, a place where the boundaries of ordinary human experience dissolved into the magical. Access to this wondrous realm was never straightforward. It required crossing a threshold, stepping through a veil that was both physical and spiritual. The most common gateways were the ancient passage tombs and burial mounds, the very same structures like Newgrange that were aligned with the solstice sun. These earthen mounds, known as Shia, were not seen merely as graves, but as the visible, physical dwellings of the gods and the noble, departed ancestors. To enter a Shia mound was not an act of desecration, but a ritual descent into the otherworld itself, a place where time flowed differently. A famous tale tells of the legendary Fionn mac Cumhale's warriors who followed a beautiful woman into a Shia. When they emerged, thinking only a single night had passed, they discovered that centuries had gone by in the mortal world, and they crumbled to dust the moment they set foot on the familiar earth. Another primary portal was the Western Sea. The Celts, whose world ended at the wild Atlantic coast, looked out over that endless expanse and imagined the setting sun each night was traveling to a land of wonders just beyond the horizon. Heroes like Bran, son of Febble, would set sail after being visited by a goddess or witnessing a silver branch laden with white blossoms, a talisman from the otherworld that compelled them to seek it out. The journey was always one of transformation, of leaving the known for the unknown, and the return, if it happened at all, was often tragic, highlighting the impossible divide between the perfection of the otherworld and the fleeting nature of mortal life. Inhabiting this liminal space between the human world and the divine otherworld were the enigmatic beings known as the Aos Shi, a term best translated as the people of the mounds, who we might more commonly refer to as the fairy folk. But to think of them as the tiny, whimsical creatures of later Victorian fairy tales is to completely misunderstand their nature and power. In the original Celtic cosmology, the Aos Shi were likely the direct descendants, the diminished cultural memory, of the great old gods and powerful nature spirits that the Druids once communed with and revered. When the old pagan order was supplanted by Christianity, the powerful deities of the Tuatha De Danann, the god of healing, the goddess of sovereignty, the master of smithcraft, did not simply vanish from the cultural consciousness. Instead, they shrank in stature and power, retreating into the landscape, becoming the hidden folk, the Aos Shi, who now dwelled within the very Shia mounds that were once their majestic palaces. They were not trivial, they were capricious, potent, and deeply tied to the fate of the land and its people. They could bring immense blessings, healing a sick child, ensuring a bountiful harvest, or bestowing artistic inspiration, or they could unleash terrible curses if their sacred spaces were disrespected. The familiar traditions of leaving out a bowl of milk or a portion of the harvest were not acts of quaint superstition. They were vital offerings to maintain a peaceful relationship with these powerful, territorial spirits, a continuation of the ancient pacts that once existed between the Druidic orders and the divine forces of nature. This complex relationship reveals a worldview where the sacred was immanent, woven directly into the fabric of the everyday. The Druids, as the intermediaries, understood that the otherworld was not a distant, abstract heaven, but a coexisting reality that could be accessed through specific locations at specific times of the year and through specific states of consciousness. The great festivals of Samhain and Beltane were considered particularly potent times when the veil between the worlds grew thin, and the owl's she were said to walk freely among mortals. This belief was not merely a spooky story, it was a reflection of a deep understanding of cyclical time and the changing energies of the earth. The Druid's role was to navigate these thresholds, to perform the rites that honored the owl's she and maintained the balance, ensuring that the fertility and order of the human world remained in harmony with the timeless power of the other. The fairy folk were, in essence, the enduring presence of the old gods, a constant reminder that the land was alive with consciousness and that humanity shared its home with other, more ancient and powerful intelligences. To understand the owls, she is to grasp the final, crucial piece of the Druidic puzzle, a world where every hillock and stream was a potential doorway, where the divine was not in the sky above but in the ground beneath your feet, and where the ultimate quest was not for salvation in the next life, but for a deeper, more magical experience of this one. For the Druids, the universe was never silent or random. It was a constant, flowing conversation between the human world and the divine, a dialogue written in the language of natural events. They operated on the fundamental belief that the gods and the spirit world were continuously communicating their will and revealing future events through signs and portents embedded in the world around them. Divination, then, was not mere superstition. It was a sacred science, a disciplined practice of reading these subtle clues, of interpreting the whispers of the cosmos to guide their people. They saw omens in the chaotic flight patterns of a bird, in the intricate textures of a sacrificed animal's organs, and in the mysterious landscapes of their own dreams, viewing these phenomena as a symbolic code that, when properly deciphered, could unveil the hidden currents of fate. One of the most prevalent and respected forms of this art was augury, the interpretation of the flight and behavior of birds. The Druids saw birds as particularly potent messengers because of their ability to traverse the three sacred realms. They walked upon the land, they drank from the waters of the sea, and they flew through the vast expanse of the sky, making them ideal intermediaries. The practice involved far more than just noticing which way a bird was flying. It was a highly nuanced system of observation. A Druid augur would carefully note the species of the bird, the wise raven, the prophetic crow, the majestic eagle, as each carried its own specific meaning. The direction of its flight was critically important. An appearance from the north might signify challenge or hidden wisdom, while a movement from the south could indicate warmth, growth, and prosperity. The altitude of the flight, the sounds the bird made, and even the number of birds seen together all contributed to a complex divinatory reading. This was not a passive observation but an active, focused engagement with the environment, a belief that the seemingly random movements of the avian world were in fact a direct expression of divine intention, a celestial script written on the wind for those trained to understand it. Another profound, if to our modern sensibilities unsettling, method was extispacy, the practice of reading the future through the entrails of a sacrificed animal. While the Romans sensationalized this as a barbaric element of human sacrifice, for the Druids it was a deeply sacred act of seeking communion with the divine. The animal, often a prized sheep or bull, was not merely killed, it was offered as a gift to the gods, its life force returned to the otherworld in exchange for knowledge. The focus of the ritual was the examination of the liver, an organ the Celts considered the very seat of life and emotion. The Druid priest, or more specifically the Vates who specialized in such divination, would remove the liver and inspect it with meticulous care. They looked for any peculiarities, unusual colors, spots, lobes of an unexpected shape, or any markings that resembled known symbols. A smooth, healthy, and symmetrical liver was a powerfully positive omen, signifying the gods' favor and a clear path ahead. Any deviation from this ideal, a dark blemish, a malformed section, a strange texture, was interpreted as a warning of coming conflict, illness, or divine displeasure. This practice reveals their belief that the cosmos was a single, interconnected whole. The macrocosm of the universe was reflected in the microcosm of a single organ. By opening this sacred vessel, they believed they were literally looking inside the body of the world itself, reading the state of the cosmic order in its most intimate and vital details. The Druids also placed great stock in the messages received during sleep, a practice known as oneromancy. They viewed the dream state not as random neural firings, but as a time when the conscious mind was quieted and the soul could travel freely, crossing the thin veil into the other world. In this liminal space, the individual could receive direct communications from ancestors, encounters with gods, or symbolic visions of future events. Important decisions, from the timing of a battle to the diagnosis of an illness, were often postponed until the druid or a designated dreamer could seek a prophetic dream. This was not a passive hope, it was an active ritual. The seeker might sleep at a specific sacred site, a burial mound or a consecrated grove, often after a period of fasting or meditation. They might invoke a specific deity for guidance before lying down to sleep. Upon waking, the dreamer would recount every detail of the vision to the druid, who would then interpret the complex symbolism. A dream of a flowing river might signify the passage of time or a coming journey, while a dream of a great tree falling could be an omen of a leader's impending death. This practice acknowledged the profound power of the subconscious mind, viewing it as a gateway to a wider reality, a tool for tapping into a well of collective and divine knowledge that was inaccessible during waking hours. Perhaps the most dramatic and politically significant of all their divinatory rites was the Taub phase, or bull feast. This elaborate ceremony was reserved for the most critical of occasions, the selection of a new high king. In a society without a simple hereditary rule of primogeniture, the identity of the rightful king was a matter of divine providence, a choice made by the gods and revealed through a sacred, sensory-overloading ritual. The ceremony began with the selection of a perfect white bull, an animal that symbolized purity, strength, and sovereignty. This bull was then sacrificed in a solemn rite, and its flesh was carefully boiled in a great cauldron, a vessel deeply symbolic of rebirth and transformation in Celtic myth. A designated seer who had undergone intense purification would then consume a massive quantity of this sacrificial meat and drink the rich, symbolic broth. This act was not about sating hunger, it was a form of sympathetic magic, a physical ingestion of the bull's sacred strength and kingly essence. The seer would then lie down to sleep, wrapped in the bull's fresh hide, a powerful conductor of spiritual energy. The combination of the heavy, ritual meal, the potent symbolism, and the sensory immersion in the hide was intended to induce a profound, trance-like state. In this altered consciousness, the seer's soul was believed to journey into the other world, where the identity of the future king would be revealed to them in a vivid, undeniable vision. They might see the man's face, the symbol on his shield, or the location where he would be found. Upon awakening, the seer would declare what they had seen, and the tribe would set out to find the divinely appointed ruler. The Taub phase demonstrates the absolute centrality of divination in the most practical aspects of Celtic life. It was the mechanism that ensured a legitimate transfer of power, a process that moved beyond mere human politics and into the realm of cosmic order, affirming their unshakable conviction that the gods were actively involved in guiding the destiny of their people, and that the future was not a secret to be feared, but a message to be decoded from the living world around them. Yet this cosmic and spiritual authority did not exist in a vacuum. It was seamlessly interwoven with a powerful secular code that governed the everyday actions of every warrior, chieftain, and farmer, a code of conduct that the Druids, as judges and teachers, were responsible for upholding and imparting. At the very heart of this ethical system was the concept of one's enech, a word that translates literally as face, but meant so much more. Your enech was your personal honor, your social standing, your publicly perceived worth, and your good name all rolled into one. It was the intangible yet immensely valuable currency of Celtic society. To have strong enech was to be respected, trusted, and influential. To lose it was to become a social pariah, a non-entity. This was not a vague notion of pride. It was a quantifiable reality that dictated your place in the world. A king with great enech could attract more warriors to his banner and form stronger alliances. A craftsman with good enech would receive more commissions. Every honorable action, every display of courage, and every act of generosity increased your enech, building your social credit. Conversely, cowardice, lying, or breaking an oath would cause your enech to crumble, making you an object of ridicule and scorn. The Druids, as the arbiters of law and tradition, were the guardians of this system. In their courts, they didn't just settle disputes over stolen cattle. They were actively adjudicating cases that could restore or destroy a person's enech, understanding that a man's honor was as vital to the community's health as his physical well-being. This relentless focus on honor was built upon a foundation of non-negotiable virtues, chief among them being truth, courage, and loyalty. Truth was not merely about factual accuracy, it was about the power and sanctity of one's word. An oath sworn before the gods and the community was an unbreakable bond. To break it was to invite not only social ruin but also divine retribution. This is why oaths were often sworn upon sacred objects, a standing stone, a revered weapon, or even the very land itself, invoking a power greater than any human authority to bear witness. Courage, or comma, was the physical manifestation of this inner truth. It was the valor displayed on the battlefield, certainly, but it also extended to the moral courage required to stand by your kin and uphold justice in the face of pressure. The ultimate expression of this was the Celtic warrior's famed disdain for death, a quality the classical writers noted with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. This fearlessness was undoubtedly bolstered by the Druidic teaching of soul transmigration. If death is merely a doorway, then dying with honor is the only thing that truly matters. Loyalty, terais, was the glue that held the fragile structure of tribal society together. Your primary loyalty was to your kin, your extended family group, and then to your chieftain or king. This created a web of mutual obligation that was the real social security net. You fought for your kin, and they fought for you. You supported your chieftain, and he provided for and protected you in return. A betrayal of this loyalty was considered one of the most heinous crimes, a tear in the social fabric that could unravel an entire tribe. Perhaps the most surprising and vital expression of this honor-based society, especially to our modern minds, was the sacred duty of hospitality. In a world without inns or roadside hotels, the willingness to welcome a stranger was not just a kindness, it was a fundamental religious and social obligation. The rule of hospitality, or oigyte, was absolute and inviolable. Once a stranger crossed your threshold and you offered them food and drink, a powerful bond was formed. For the duration of their stay, they were under your protection. You were responsible for their safety and well-being, even at the cost of your own life. This system created a safe passage for travelers, poets, and diplomats across a landscape that could otherwise be fraught with danger from rival clans. The shared feast was the central ritual of this hospitality. To invite someone to your table to share your bread and meat and ale was to create a temporary kinship. It was an act of immense generosity that greatly increased your enech, showcasing your wealth and your noble character. The great halls of Celtic chieftains were not just military headquarters, they were stages for this nightly drama of generosity. The epic tales are filled with descriptions of vast cauldrons of pork, endless streams of ale, and the sound of the harp, all provided freely to any who came. To be a stingy host was to be a person of weak enech, a figure of contempt. This practice ensured the flow of information, the strengthening of alliances, and the cultural exchange that kept the Celtic world dynamic and interconnected. Herein lies one of the most fascinating tensions within the Druidic societal role. They were the intellectual architects and enforcers of this heroic warrior ethos that celebrated martial prowess, personal glory, and the defense of honor. Yet, simultaneously, they themselves were famously non-combatants. They did not fight in battles. Even more strikingly, they possessed the unique authority to step between two armies on the brink of war and command a truce. Classical sources record that during the great annual assembly of the Druids, all warfare would cease throughout the Celtic territories. This was not a mere suggestion. It was a divine mandate that was obeyed without question. How do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory functions? The answer lies in recognizing the Druids as the ultimate balance keepers. They understood that the warrior spirit was essential for a tribe's survival and identity, but left unchecked, it could lead to self-destruction through endless cycles of feud and vengeance. Their role was to channel that raw, competitive energy into a structured system of honor and law, and to impose periods of peace that allowed for diplomacy, trade, and the vital cultural functions of the great festivals to proceed. They were the calm at the center of the storm, the voice of a higher, more cosmic order that transcended the immediate passions of a battlefield. They upheld the warrior's right to earn glory, but only within the bounds of a code that also valued truth, loyalty, and the sacred obligations of peace. This delicate balancing act between the ferocity of the warrior and the wisdom of the peacemaker was the supreme achievement of their ancient code, a system that sought not to eliminate conflict, but to ritualize and contain it, ensuring the long-term stability and spiritual health of their vibrant, formidable civilization. Beyond their roles as judges and astronomers, the Druids served as the primary physicians of their people, possessing a vast and sophisticated understanding of the natural pharmacy that thrived in the forests and meadows around them. Their approach to healing was a holistic fusion of empirical science and spiritual belief, where a plant's physical properties were inseparable from its symbolic meaning and the energy of the land from which it was harvested. They did not simply see a patch of foxglove, they saw a powerful spirit that could regulate the very pulse of life, a tool of immense power that demanded the utmost respect and precision. This knowledge was not haphazard. It was a carefully guarded tradition passed down through years of apprenticeship, where a student would learn to identify hundreds of plants by sight, scent, and touch, and to understand their uses, dosages, and the sacred rituals required to harvest them without offending the plant's spirit. The Druidic healer was a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, treating illness as an imbalance not just of the body, but of the entire person within their environment, drawing upon a deep well of botanical wisdom that modern science is only now beginning to validate. One of the most striking examples of this dualistic knowledge involves the beautiful but deadly foxglove with its tall spires of bell-shaped flowers. The Druids knew that this plant held the power to influence the human heart. In tiny, meticulously measured doses, preparations made from foxglove leaves could act as a powerful cardiac stimulant, potentially helping those whose hearts beat weakly or irregularly. They understood that it could increase the force of muscular contractions, essentially acting as a primitive but effective form of digitalis, a drug still derived from this plant and used in modern cardiology. However, they were also acutely aware that the line between medicine and poison was terrifyingly thin. A slight miscalculation in dosage could easily suppress the heart instead of strengthening it, leading to a swift and fatal outcome. This precise, dangerous knowledge underscores their role as true scientists of the natural world, who through generations of careful observation and likely tragic trial and error, learned to harness one of nature's most potent and unforgiving remedies. Their botanical repertoire extended far beyond such dramatic poisons into a whole spectrum of common yet powerful plants. They harvested vervain, a modest-looking herb, considering it one of the most sacred plants for purification and protection. It was used in rituals to cleanse sacred spaces and to create protective amulets, but it also had practical applications as a mild sedative and a treatment for headaches and fevers, its anti-inflammatory properties offering tangible relief. Similarly, the humble yarrow, with its feathery leaves and clusters of white flowers, was a staple in the healer's kit. Its very name, Achillea, harkens back to the Greek hero Achilles, who was said to have used it to stanch the bleeding of his warriors, a use the Druids certainly knew. They would apply the crushed leaves directly to wounds to slow bleeding and prevent infection, leveraging its astringent and antimicrobial qualities. They also prepared yarrow teas to reduce fevers and ease cold symptoms, recognizing its ability to induce sweating. Another quiet giant of the Druidic pharmacy was plantain, not the banana-like fruit, but the broad-leafed weed that stubbornly grows in compacted soils. They used its leaves as a poultice for burns, stings, and cuts, harnessing its cooling, drawing, and healing properties to soothe skin irritations and promote recovery, a use that persists in herbalism to this day. This practical knowledge was inextricably woven with a layer of spiritual practice and a principle known as the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that the gods had marked each plant with a sign, a clue in its shape, color, or habitat that revealed its healing purpose. A plant that resembled a body part was meant to treat ailments of that part. For instance, the roots of the orchid, which often look like a pair of testicles, were used as an aphrodisiac and to treat male sexual disorders. Lungwort, a plant whose leaves are mottled with spots reminiscent of a diseased lung, was used to treat pulmonary complaints like bronchitis and asthma. The walnut, encased in a shell that looks strikingly like a human skull, was believed to treat head injuries and ailments of the brain. This wasn't seen as superstition, but as a divine language, a system of correspondences that connected the macrocosm of the human body to the microcosm of the plant world. It provided a logical, symbolic framework for organizing and remembering their vast herbal knowledge, guiding them in their selection of remedies. The harvesting of these plants was itself a sacred ritual, never a simple act of collection. The Druids believed that a plant's healing power was not just chemical but also spiritual, and that this spirit had to be appeased and honored. This is vividly illustrated by Pliny's description of the mistletoe harvest with a golden sickle. That level of ceremony was reserved for the most sacred of plants, but the principle applied across the board. A healer would often approach a plant at a specific time, perhaps at dawn, under a particular phase of the moon or on a day deemed auspicious by their calendar. They might first offer a silent prayer or a small token of thanks to the plant's spirit before carefully cutting it with a bronze or flint knife, avoiding iron, which was considered a corrupting metal. The intention was to gather the plant's vital essence or numen at its peak potency, believing that a respectfully harvested plant held far more power than one ripped rudely from the ground. This practice reflects a worldview of reciprocity, where humanity was not a master over nature, but a partner in a living, conscious cosmos, where healing was a collaborative act between the healer, the patient, and the spirit of the plant itself. But for all their profound spiritual and scientific wisdom, there exists a practice within Druidic culture that seems to clash violently with our modern sensibilities. A dark and potent strand woven directly into their belief in the soul's power, the sacred veneration of the human head. To the Celtic peoples, the head was not merely the seat of intellect, it was the very throne of the soul, the sacred vessel that contained a person's life force, their wisdom, their essence, and their ultimate power. They believed that the head housed an individual's spiritual energy, their minos or personal power, and that this power did not simply vanish at the moment of death. Instead, it lingered, concentrated within the skull, which became a potent relic, a source of oracular wisdom and supernatural strength that could be accessed, communed with, and even harnessed by those who knew the rites. This belief transforms what we might see as simple barbarism into a complex, deeply spiritual act rooted in their core understanding of an immortal soul and the tangible nature of spiritual energy. The archaeological record provides chillingly vivid evidence of this belief system in action. Across the Celtic world, from the sanctuaries of Gaul to the hill forts of Britain, archaeologists have uncovered what can only be described as skull shrines. At the ritual site of Entremont in southern France, stone pillars were found carved with niches explicitly designed to display human skulls, often those of young men, likely warriors. These were not casually discarded remains. They were carefully curated, prominently featured trophies, integrated into the very architecture of a sacred space. In Roquepetus, another French sanctuary, a portal stone was unearthed featuring carved cavities that once held real human skulls, fastened in place with iron nails, creating a terrifying and awe-inspiring entrance to a place of worship. Perhaps one of the most striking discoveries was made in a cave in Yorkshire, England, where a collection of more than 150 human skulls was arranged, the majority belonging to adult males. What is most telling, however, is that these skulls were predominantly those of high-status individuals, identified by evidence of good nutrition and a lack of manual labor, and they showed signs of careful preparation, often being expertly decapitated and meticulously cleaned. This was not the result of a single massacre. It was a long-standing ritualistic practice of collecting and preserving the heads of the most powerful and noble members of rival tribes. This brings us to the practice that so horrified their Roman chroniclers, head hunting. Classical writers like the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus and the Roman poet Lucan describe how Celtic warriors would decapitate their most worthy foes on the battlefield and treat these heads with a reverence that baffled the Mediterranean world. After a battle, a warrior would take the head of a formidable enemy he had defeated, carefully clean the flesh from the skull, and then meticulously gild the bone in gold or silver, preserving it in a special chest. These were not hidden away in shame. They were the warrior's most prized possessions, brought out with pride to show to honored guests. Diodorus wrote that some warriors were so proud of their collection that they would refuse to part with a head even for its weight in gold. This seems like a grotesque boast to us, but within the Celtic spiritual framework, it was a logical and powerful act. By taking the head of a powerful enemy, a warrior was not just collecting a trophy. He was literally capturing and containing that enemy's strength, courage, and wisdom. He was preventing the departed soul from seeking vengeance, and more importantly, he was appropriating the enemy's minos for himself and his tribe. A great champion's power could thus be absorbed, adding to the collective spiritual reservoir of the victors. The head of a wise elder or a powerful druid would have been considered an even greater prize, a source of prophetic insight and ancient knowledge that could be consulted long after the body had returned to the earth. This practice fits perfectly within their broader cosmology, particularly their belief in the permeable boundary between this world and the other world. The preserved, speaking head is a recurring and powerful motif throughout Celtic mythology, further cementing the idea that this was more than a battlefield custom. In the Welsh cycle of the Mabinogion, the god Bran the Blessed, after being mortally wounded in a great war, instructs his followers to cut off his head. His head continues to live, speaking, feasting, and leading his companions on a magical journey for 87 years, providing them with wisdom and companionship until the moment it is finally buried in what is now the White Hill in London, as a protective talisman for the whole island. In the Ulster cycle of Irish myth, the hero Conall Cernach keeps the head of his rival Mesjedra, using it to mix with his porridge to absorb the man's courage. These are not arbitrary stories, they are mythological expressions of a core cultural truth. The head was a conduit. In their view, the soul, concentrated in the skull, could continue to manifest its power, to speak prophecies, to offer counsel, to protect a land, or to bestow strength. The ritualistic display of heads at gateways and shrines was not just about intimidation. It was about harnessing this lingering spiritual power to guard a community's sacred boundaries, to literally embed the sole force of powerful beings into the defenses of a hill fort or the sanctity of a temple. It was a form of spiritual technology, a way to trap and utilize the potent energy of a soul in transition, ensuring that even in death, a powerful individual could serve the community, their voice silenced only in the physical world, but their essence forever captured, revered, and integrated into the spiritual armor of the tribe. Navigating the complex spiritual landscape of the Celts requires us to step away from the idea of a single, unified pantheon ruled by a neat hierarchy of gods, like the orderly family on Mount Olympus. Instead, the Celtic divine world was a vibrant, often chaotic tapestry of powerful, local, and deeply tribal deities. A god worshipped with fervor in one valley might be completely unknown in the next, and their names and attributes could shift from tribe to tribe. This wasn't a sign of a primitive religion, but rather a reflection of a world where the sacred was immanent and specific to a place. The spirit of a particular river, the genius of a specific forest, the protective power of a local mountain. These were the foundational forces that people interacted with daily. Over time, certain of these localized spirits grew in renown, their influence spreading across regions until they became the great archetypal figures we recognize today, figures the Druids were uniquely equipped to understand and petition. Among the most brilliant of these figures was Lugh, a god whose very name might be related to the word for light or oath. He was not a god of one single domain, but a master of all of them, earning him the epithet Lamphada, Lugh of the long arm, perhaps referring to his far-reaching power or his skill with a spear. His most famous story involves his arrival at the court of the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of the gods. The gatekeeper, following the king's orders to admit only those who possess a unique skill not already present at court, challenges him. Lugh asks if they have a master carpenter, a champion warrior, a harper, a poet, a historian, a metalsmith, and so on. For every role, the court already has a specialist. Lugh then poses his final, triumphant question. Then do you have one man who possesses all these skills? They did not, and Lugh was admitted, later leading them to victory in the great battle against the monstrous Fomorians. He represents the ideal of the unified, multi-talented individual, the polytechnic genius whose diverse abilities combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts. For the Druids, Lugh embodied the intellectual synthesis they themselves practiced, the combination of law, astronomy, medicine, and poetry into a single, overarching wisdom. In stark contrast to Lugh's radiant mastery stands the powerful and terrifying figure of the Morrigan, a goddess who defies simple categorization. She is most often described as a trio of sisters Bodibi, Macha, and Anand, or as a single, shape-shifting entity whose forms reveal her multifaceted nature. She is the goddess of war, but not in the straightforward sense of a patron of warriors like Mars. Her domain is the chaotic, psychological, and fateful aspect of battle. She appears on the battlefield as a scald crow, a carrion bird, reveling in the carnage and prophesying death and victory with her chilling cries. She can also appear as a beautiful young woman washing the blood-soaked armor of a warrior destined to die, or as a hideous hag who can curse an entire army with weakness and fear. Yet, crucially, she is also a goddess of sovereignty. The rightful king of the land had to engage in a sacred marriage with her, often symbolized by encountering her as the hag, and through his acceptance or courage, transforming her into the beautiful maiden, thus securing the kingdom's fertility and prosperity. The Morrigan represents the raw, untamed power of the land itself, its capacity to create and to destroy, to bless a ruler and to utterly annihilate an army. She is the embodiment of the capricious, fierce, and ultimately sovereign force of nature and fate that the Druids had to appease and interpret through their divinatory arts. From the battlefield, we turn to the deep, silent heart of the forest, where another powerful archetype reigned, Cernunnos, the Horned One. While we know his name primarily from a single inscription on a now-lost altar found in Paris, his image is one of the most widespread and iconic in all of Celtic art. He is consistently depicted as a man, often seated in the lotus position, with the majestic antlers of a stag crowning his head. In his lap or in his hands, he holds the torque, a symbol of nobility and power, and a ram-headed serpent, a creature that seems to blend the earthly with the chthonic. He is the lord of the wild, the master of animals, and the god of fertility, abundance, and the untamed, generative forces of nature. His antlers connect him directly to the stag, an animal revered for its virility, its cyclical shedding and regrowth, and its sovereignty over the woodland realm. Cernunnos represents the raw, unbridled life force that animates the natural world, the pulse of the forest itself. He is not a god to be worshipped in a temple, but one to be encountered in the sacred grove, a potent reminder of the wildness that exists both in the world and within the human spirit. The Druids, as the guardians of the Nemetons, would have been the primary mediators between human communities and this powerful, vegetative god, performing rituals to ensure his blessings of a successful hunt, fertile flocks, and the continued abundance of the wilderness upon which they all depended. And then there is Brigid, a goddess whose popularity and enduring power was so immense that she was seamlessly transitioned into the Christian era as Saint Brigid of Kildare. She was a triple goddess presiding over three essential, life-giving domains: healing, poetry, and smithcraft. At first glance, this combination might seem unusual, but for the Celts, it represented a perfect, interconnected cycle of creation and transformation. As a goddess of healing, she oversaw the well-being of the body and spirit, with sacred wells dedicated to her across Ireland and Britain, whose waters were believed to possess curative properties. As a goddess of poetry, she was the patron of inspiration, of the sacred fire in the mind that gives birth to prophecy, history, and lore, the very arts practiced by the bards and druids. And as a goddess of smithcraft, she governed the transformative magic of the forge, where raw ore was turned into potent, functional, and beautiful objects: plows, weapons, and torques. The smith was a semi-magical figure in Celtic society, and Brigid's patronage connected the physical transformation of metal to the spiritual transformation of healing and the intellectual transformation of poetic inspiration. She represents the sacred fire that purifies, illuminates, and creates, a force essential for the survival and flourishing of civilization itself. So, where did the Druids stand in relation to this diverse, powerful, and often unpredictable assembly of deities? Their role was absolutely central and multidimensionally demanding. They were the essential intermediaries, the diplomats, and the translators between the human world and the divine. The common person would have had a direct, personal relationship with the local spirits of their hearth and field, but for the great tribal gods like the Morrigan or Lug, whose moods could determine the fate of the entire people, specialized knowledge was required. The Druids were the theologians who preserved and interpreted the complex myths and genealogies of the gods, understanding their relationships, their personalities, and their spheres of influence. They were the ritual specialists who knew the precise formulas of prayer, the correct sacrificial offerings, and the exact ceremonial actions needed to gain a deity's favor or avert their wrath. A farmer might pray to a local spirit for a good harvest, but it was the Druids as a collective who would perform the great seasonal rites at places like Tara or Uisnech, enacting a sacred drama to ensure that Lug's light would strengthen the sun, or that the Morrigan's favor would protect the kingdom from invasion. They were the ones who could read the omens to determine if the gods were pleased, and who could advise the king on whether the time was auspicious, guided by the Morrigan's complex demands of sovereignty, to go to war or to forge a treaty. In a world where the divine was immanent, capricious, and intimately involved in human affairs, the Druid was the master of the interface, the learned scholar and practiced ritualist who could navigate the treacherous and magnificent currents of the Celtic spiritual realm. ensuring that the community remained in a state of balance and favor with the powerful forces that governed their lives. Their land and their ultimate destiny. This deep connection to the land and its spirits, however, would soon face an existential threat from a foreign power whose world you could not have been more different, the relentlessly expanding Roman Empire. For Rome, the conquest of new territory was about more than just military victory. It was a comprehensive civilizing mission, a project of imposing a uniform system of law, language, and religion upon the diverse peoples they subjugated. And in the Druids, the Romans encountered the one institution they could not tolerate: a powerful, unified, and deeply entrenched intellectual class that held the spiritual and cultural loyalty of the Celtic tribes across all of Gaul and Britain. The Druids were the key that held the entire Celtic societal structure together, and Rome knew that to truly control the people, they had to break that key. What followed was not merely a military conflict, but a deliberate, systematic campaign of intellectual and spiritual erasure, a calculated effort to silence the living voice of the ancient code forever. The Roman antipathy for the Druids began long before the legions landed in force. Earlier writers like Julius Caesar, while providing some of our most detailed accounts, had already laid the groundwork for portraying them as a barbaric obstacle to civilization, emphasizing their practice of human sacrifice as a justification for Roman intervention. But it was under the reign of Emperor Tiberius in the 1st century that this prejudice hardened into official state policy. Around the year 14 A.D., a formal senatorial decree was issued that outlawed the Druids and their practices throughout the Roman world. This was not a spontaneous act of religious intolerance, it was a coldly pragmatic political decision. The Druids were the one pan-tribal authority that could unite the famously fractious Celtic chieftains against a common enemy. Their great annual assemblies, where Druids from all over Gaul would gather to settle legal disputes and discuss matters of philosophy, were also potential hotbeds of anti-Roman sentiment and strategic planning. They were a shadow government, an alternative source of power that existed entirely outside of Roman control. And for an empire built on hierarchy and absolute authority, such an independent intellectual network was an unacceptable threat. This policy of suppression reached its brutal climax under Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 A.D. Claudius, a man deeply interested in history and religion, took the campaign against the Druids to a new level of severity. Historical records, such as those from the Roman historian Suetonius, indicate that Claudius formally and completely abolished the barbarous and inhuman religion of the Druids in Gaul. This was more than just a law on a scroll, it was a declaration of total cultural war. The Roman military machine, having subdued the major tribes in Gaul, now turned its attention to the very heart of Druidic power, their sacred landscapes. The strategy was devastatingly simple and symbolically profound. The sacred groves, the nemetons that were the open-air cathedrals of the Celtic world, were deliberately targeted for destruction. Roman troops, armed with axes and fire, marched into these hallowed spaces and systematically cut down the ancient oaks and desecrated the springs. This was not just vandalism, it was a calculated act of psychological and spiritual warfare. For a culture that saw divinity in the living tree, to witness a legionary hacking down a 1,000-year-old oak was akin to watching the murder of a god. It was a direct assault on the cosmic axis of their world, a message from Rome that their gods were powerless and their most sacred connections to the land were now severed. The final, bloody stronghold of organized Druidism became the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. In the year 60 A.D., the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a full-scale assault on the island, recognizing it as the last refuge of the Druidic order and a bastion of native resistance. The Roman historian Tacitus gives us a chillingly dramatic account of the invasion. As the Roman legions approached the shore, they were met with a terrifying sight. The opposite bank was lined with a dense mass of Celtic warriors, but standing in front of them were the Druids themselves. They were not armed with swords, but with spiritual weapons, their hands raised to the heavens, shouting horrific curses and imprecations against the invading army. Around them, women dressed in funeral black, their hair wild like that of the Furies from Roman myth, ran through the ranks brandishing torches. The scene was designed to be terrifying, a display of raw, chaotic, otherworldly power meant to freeze the Roman advance in its tracks through sheer supernatural terror. For a moment, it worked. Tacitus records that the Roman soldiers stood paralyzed, superstition draining the courage from their limbs. But their commanders rallied them, shouting that they must not fear a herd of fanatical women and mad priests. The professional discipline of the legion overcame the primal fear, and they surged forward. The result was a massacre. The Celtic defenders were cut down, and the sacred groves of Mona were put to the torch. The altars where human sacrifice was said to have been performed were smashed. It was a decisive, brutal end to the Druids as a cohesive, publicly powerful institution in Britain. The consequences of this systematic eradication were catastrophic and irreversible for the knowledge system the Druids represented. With their sacred groves destroyed, their practices outlawed on pain of death, and their political influence shattered, the organized structure that had supported their 20-year apprenticeships collapsed. The great centers of learning were gone. The aspiring student could no longer travel to a sacred island to study under a master. The chain of oral transmission, which had carried the law, the genealogies, the astronomical data, and the medicinal secrets for centuries, was broken. The knowledge did not vanish in a single day, of course. It fragmented and went underground, scattering into the remote hills and isolated rural communities. Some of it was preserved in mutated forms by the bards, who could more easily disguise their knowledge as entertainment or folk wisdom. Other fragments survived in the practices of local cunning folk and healers, who kept the herbal lore alive but often lost the philosophical and cosmological context that gave it deeper meaning. What was lost forever was the integrated whole, the seamless connection between the law of the land and the movement of the stars, between the healing properties of a plant and its symbolic place in the Ogham alphabet, between the role of a judge and the duty of a cosmic balance keeper. The Romans, by targeting the Druids so effectively, did not just conquer a people, they successfully dismantled an entire worldview, leaving behind a spiritual and intellectual vacuum that would slowly be filled by other forces, forever altering the cultural landscape of Western Europe. So, with their sacred groves in ashes and their public voice silenced by Roman law, did the flame of Druidic wisdom simply vanish forever into the mists of history? The answer is far more complex and intriguing than a simple yes or no. While the organized, politically powerful Druidism of Gaul and southern Britain was indeed shattered, its profound knowledge did not simply disappear. Instead, it underwent a remarkable transformation, seeping into the cultural bedrock of the Celtic lands and surviving for centuries in new, often disguised forms. It's a story not of extinction, but of adaptation, of a river of knowledge forced underground, only to resurface in unexpected springs and streams. One of the most vital conduits for this survival was the enduring institution of the bardic schools, particularly in regions like Ireland and Wales, which lay at the very fringes of the Roman Empire and were never fully subdued by its legions. Here, the intellectual tradition of the learned classes persisted with remarkable resilience. These were not the open-air gatherings of the ancient Druids, but formalized schools where aspiring poets, historians, and jurists underwent a rigorous training that echoed the Druidic apprenticeship of old. A student or filly in Ireland would spend up to 12 years memorizing a vast body of lore. They learned the elaborate genealogies of the noble families, the complex Brehon law codes, and the sprawling mythological cycles that preserved the history and identity of their people. This was all accomplished through an intense oral tradition, with knowledge passed down in intricate metrical verse designed to be unforgettable. The echoes of the Druidic past are unmistakable. The bard was now the primary keeper of the culture's memory, fulfilling a role once shared with the Druids and Vates. They held immense social power, capable of satirizing a king into exile with their verse, a direct descendant of the old Glamdissin. Their poetry was not mere entertainment. It was a functional, vital art that preserved law, history, and philosophy, all wrapped in the beautiful mnemonic cloak of language. These schools became the new repositories of the ancient code, safeguarding its core principles even as the outer form of the religion that birthed it faded away. Simultaneously, the deep, animistic beliefs of the Druids began to merge seamlessly with the local folklore of the common people, ensuring their worldview endured in the daily lives of rural communities. The powerful gods and goddesses, stripped of their grand temples and public worship, did not die. They simply retreated, diminishing in stature but not in presence. They became the Owls-She, the fairy folk, the hidden people of the mounds and streams. The old reverence for the land did not vanish, it was transferred. The sacred well that once belonged to a healing goddess like Brigid was still visited, its waters still believed to hold curative powers. People now might tie a clootie, a strip of cloth, to a nearby tree as an offering, a practice that continues to this day, its pagan origins largely forgotten. The great protective oak tree might now have a Christian chapel built beside it, but the underlying sense of that place being inherently holy, charged with a spiritual presence, remained intact. The annual festivals of Samhain and Beltane, which marked the thinning of the veil between worlds, persisted as Halloween and May Day, their ancient, spooky, and fertile symbolism repurposed but never fully erased. This folkloric survival represents the democratization of Druidic wisdom. It was no longer the exclusive domain of a learned elite, but became woven into the very fabric of everyday life, a set of unspoken rules and respectful practices that governed how one interacted with the spirit-filled landscape. The most fascinating and successful adaptation of all, however, occurred with the arrival of a new spiritual force, Celtic Christianity. Unlike the Roman Church, which often sought to aggressively supplant pagan beliefs, the early Christian missionaries in places like Ireland, Wales, and Scotland frequently pursued a path of brilliant syncretism. They understood that to win the hearts of the people, they could not simply tear down their sacred world. They had to baptize it to find the points of connection between the old faith and the new. This led to the creation of a uniquely Celtic form of Christianity, one that often feels profoundly Druidic in its texture and tone. The most striking evidence of this is the way old gods and goddesses were seamlessly transformed into beloved Christian saints. The triple goddess Brigid, patron of healing, poetry, and smithcraft, became Saint Brigid of Kildare, whose monastery was said to have an eternal flame tended by nuns, a direct echo of the pagan priestesses who likely once tended her sacred fire. Her feast day on February 1st is the old festival of Imbolc, and her association with healing wells and protection of livestock remained perfectly intact, now simply offered in the name of Christ. This syncretism extended to the very lifestyle of the early Celtic monks. They exhibited a deep, reverential connection to the natural world that would have been instantly familiar to a Druid. Instead of building their monasteries in towns, they sought out thin places, remote, wild locations like Skellig Michael, a stark, soaring rock island off the Irish coast, or the windswept Isle of Iona in Scotland. These were the new Nemetons, places where the veil between heaven and earth was felt to be thin. The Celtic monks spoke of feeling a kinship with the animals, and their beautifully illuminated manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, are filled with intricate, swirling patterns that directly mirror the abstract, Latin-style art of their pagan ancestors. The letters themselves seem to blossom into living, organic forms, as if the Ogham tree alphabet had been translated into a new, vibrant spiritual language. The famous Chi Rho page isn't just a Christian symbol. It is a wild, vibrant jungle of knotwork and beasts, a celebration of God's creation that feels far more connected to the immanent, animistic cosmos of the Druids than to the more transcendent, ordered God of Roman theology. These monks became the new philosophers of the natural world, the new keepers of learning in a dark age, and in their hermitages and illuminated gospels, the ancient code of the Druids found a powerful and enduring new voice, ensuring that its essential wisdom, the sacredness of the land, the power of the word, and the interconnectedness of all life would echo down through the centuries. But if the true voice of the Druids had been silenced by Rome and driven into the hidden streams of folklore, how did the iconic image of the white-robed, bearded sage standing solemnly at Stonehenge become so powerfully fixed in our modern imagination? The answer lies not in the Iron Age, but in a much later period of profound social and intellectual upheaval, the 18th and 19th centuries. This was the era of the Romantic and Druid revival, a fascinating chapter where the ancient wise men were not so much rediscovered as they were reinvented, reshaped into a powerful symbol that served the needs and desires of a rapidly industrializing and modernizing world. The historical Druids, the multifaceted judges and philosophers, had faded into the mist, but their ghost was about to be summoned back in a spectacular new form, one that continues to haunt us to this day. At the very forefront of this reinvention stood a man of both science and spirited imagination, William Stukeley, an antiquarian and Anglican clergyman. Stukeley was one of the first to undertake serious, measured surveys of the great prehistoric monuments of the British landscape, most notably Stonehenge and the massive stone complex at Overbury. His detailed drawings and observations were, for their time, pioneering works of field archaeology. However, Stukeley was a man caught between two worlds, the emerging age of empirical reason and a deep, almost mystical yearning for a spiritually pure national past. As he walked among the towering sarcens of Stonehenge, he became convinced he was not just studying an ancient astronomical calculator, but walking through the very temple of the British patriarchs. He developed a grand, sweeping theory that these monuments were not built by the mysterious pre-Celtic peoples we now know were responsible, but were the handiwork of the Druids. In his influential 1740 book, Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, he wove an elaborate narrative describing the site as the central sanctuary of a sophisticated, monotheistic religion that predated the Romans and was uncorrupted by the pagan excesses his classical sources described. He saw the layout of Stonehenge and its surrounding landscape as a grand serpentine pattern, a symbol of divine wisdom. Stukeley's Druids were not the potentially blood-stained priests of Roman accounts. They were virtuous, patriarchal philosophers, a native British intellectual elite who worshipped one supreme God in the open air, their faith a pristine, natural precursor to Christianity itself. His work was a potent blend of careful measurement and fanciful speculation, and it was this compelling mixture that captured the public's imagination, creating an enduring but entirely false link between the Druids and the megaliths that would take over a century of proper archaeology to untangle. Stukeley's imaginative leap did not occur in a vacuum. It was perfectly attuned to the rising tide of Romanticism, a cultural movement that was sweeping across Europe as a powerful reaction against the cold rationality of the Enlightenment and the bleak, soot-choked realities of the Industrial Revolution. The Romantics championed emotion over reason, the sublime power of nature over the orderly confines of the city, and the wild, untamed spirit of the national passed over a cosmopolitan present. In this new cultural climate, the figure of the Druid was the perfect vessel for a collective yearning. He was recast as the ultimate romantic hero, a solitary, bearded sage, deeply attuned to the mysteries of the ancient, untouched landscape, a keeper of esoteric secrets lost to modern man. This idealized Druid was a pure intellectual, a poet-philosopher who found God not in a stuffy church, but in the whispering leaves of a sacred oak and the majestic cycle of the stars. This image was a clear projection, a mirror held up to the anxieties of the 18th and 19th century. In an age where factory smoke was beginning to blot out the sky and traditional rural life was being upended, the fantasy of a noble, native spiritual tradition, deeply connected to the land, offered a powerful form of consolation and a sense of lost purity. The Druid became a symbol of everything modern society felt it had sacrificed at the altar of progress. This romanticized vision was then massively popularized and cemented into the public consciousness through the arts. The Welsh poet and forger Iolo Morgannwg, a fascinating and controversial figure, claimed to have discovered ancient Welsh manuscripts that preserved the authentic rituals and teachings of the original Druids. In reality, he was a brilliant fabricator, weaving together fragments of genuine Welsh tradition with his own inventive poetry and Masonic-inspired ceremony to create an entirely new Druidic tradition. It was Iolo who established the now familiar structure of the three circles of existence, and who composed much of the ritual that would be adopted by newly formed Druid orders. Meanwhile, in the world of painting, artists like William Blake embraced the myth with fervent passion. Blake, who saw the industrial, dark satanic mills as a spiritual plague, famously incorporated Stukeley's image of the ancient Britons into his visionary art, portraying the Druids as gigantic, heroic figures of primordial wisdom. This artistic celebration reached its zenith in the massive nationalistic canvases of the Victorian era. Paintings depicted Druids as majestic, white-robed priests performing baptisms or solemn rites at Stonehenge as the sun rose, bathed in a heavenly, reverent light. These images were wildly anachronistic, but they were incredibly effective, creating a visual shorthand for the Druid that was noble, peaceful, and profoundly spiritual, a far cry from the complex and sometimes brutal reality described by Caesar and Tacitus. This revival was not merely an artistic or intellectual curiosity. It quickly blossomed into a full-fledged social and spiritual movement with the establishment of formal Druid orders. The most famous of these, the Ancient Order of Druids, was founded in London in 1781, not as a pagan religious group, but as a benevolent fraternal society, much like the Freemasons. Its members, drawn from the burgeoning middle class, would meet in taverns, wearing robes and employing rituals largely invented by Iolo Morgannwg and others, seeking fellowship, mutual support, and a connection to what they believed was their noble ancestral heritage. The focus was on self-improvement, philanthropy, and celebrating a romanticized version of nature. Crucially, this revived Druidism was almost entirely depaganized. The powerful, capricious gods of the Celts were replaced by a vague, deistic Great Spirit, or were simply ignored. The complex, orally transmitted knowledge of the ancient learned class was swapped for invented ceremonies that provided a sense of mystery and tradition. These new Druids were not training for 20 years to memorize lore or read entrails. They were holding gatherings and charitable events. The movement provided a sense of identity and continuity in a world that was changing at a dizzying pace, offering a ritualized escape into an idealized, simpler past that served the psychological needs of the present. This grand reimagining, however, came at a significant cost to historical understanding. The romantic, white-robed sage completely overshadowed the more nuanced and challenging historical figure. The gritty reality of the Iron Age, a world of tribal warfare, intricate legal systems, and a spiritual practice that could include both profound philosophical debate and the stark reality of ritual sacrifice, was smoothed over and sanitized. The Druid as a political power broker, a judge who could halt armies, a master of a vast oral library of knowledge, was replaced by the generic wise man of the oak grove. This created a schism that historians and archaeologists are still working to repair. For well over a century, the serious academic study of the Celtic world was hampered by the pervasive influence of these romantic myths. It has taken meticulous archaeological work, critical re-evaluation of the classical texts, and a greater appreciation for the insights provided by early medieval Irish and Welsh literature to slowly peel back the layers of 18th century fantasy and glimpse the more complex, formidable, and truly fascinating intellectual that was the historical Druid. The revival gave us an icon, but in doing so, it temporarily obscured the authentic, lost voice it sought so earnestly to recover. So, where does this long and winding journey leave us today? The story of the Druids, it turns out, did not end with the Roman conquest or fade entirely into folklore. It has experienced a remarkable and vibrant resurgence in the modern era. From the romantic reinventions of the 18th and 19th centuries, a new, living tradition has blossomed, one that seeks to translate the core themes of the ancient wisdom into a language for our time. This is the world of modern Druidry, a diverse spiritual path practiced by thousands around the globe, with organizations like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, often called OBOD, standing as one of its most prominent and accessible voices. At its heart, this contemporary path is built upon three foundational pillars: a deep and reverential connection to the natural world, the cultivation of creativity as a sacred act, and a committed journey of personal and spiritual development. Modern Druids often speak of seeking to re-enchant the world, to see the divine not as a distant figure in a far-off heaven, but as the living, breathing presence in every leaf, stone, and stream. This is a spirituality that finds its cathedral in the local park, its hymns in the sound of the wind, and its most profound rituals in the simple, mindful act of walking through a forest. The creativity of the bard is celebrated as a fundamental human impulse, a way of co-creating with the universe, whether through poetry, music, art, or simply the way we live our daily lives. And the pursuit of wisdom, the central quest of the ancient Ovates and Druids, is reframed as an inward journey of self-discovery, meditation, and the study of lore, all aimed at fostering a more compassionate, aware, and integrated human being. This is a deeply experiential path, one that emphasizes practice over dogma and personal revelation over rigid doctrine. This leads us directly to the most significant and ongoing conversation surrounding these modern groups. Are they a genuine revival of an ancient spirit, or are they essentially a new invention? The honest answer is that they are powerfully and unapologetically both, and understanding this duality is key to appreciating their true nature. On one hand, the connection to the past is profound and heartfelt. Modern Druidry is not a random collection of New Age ideas. It is consciously and thoughtfully inspired by the very fragments of history and myth we have been exploring. Practitioners diligently study the Celtic myths, learn about the Ogham alphabet as a system of symbolic meaning, celebrate the eightfold wheel of the year with festivals like Samhain and Beltane, and feel a deep kinship with the ancient wise ones who revered the land. There is a sincere attempt to reach across the centuries and grasp the essence of the Druidic worldview, that sense of sacred interconnection, the reverence for the land, and the pursuit of wisdom. The three-grade system of Bard, Ovate, and Druid used by orders like OBOD is itself a direct homage to the learned classes of old, providing a structured framework for a modern person to walk a similar path of progressive learning and spiritual maturation. Yet, on the other hand, there is a widespread and intellectually honest acknowledgement within these very communities that a direct, unbroken lineage to the Iron Age Druids is impossible. The chain of oral transmission was irrevocably shattered. The specific social and political context in which the ancient Druids operated, as judges, teachers, and advisors to tribal chieftains, is gone forever. No one today is learning the entirety of tribal law through 20 years of memorization or presiding over a bull feast to select a high king. Therefore, modern Druidry does not claim to be a precise reconstruction of a lost religion. Instead, it is better understood as a creative and dynamic reimagining, a spiritual path that uses the inspiration of the past as a fertile soil from which to grow something new and relevant for the 21st century. It responds to contemporary needs, the deep societal yearning for ecological connection in an age of environmental crisis, the search for personal meaning outside of traditional religious institutions, and the desire for a spirituality that honors both the rational mind and the mystical heart. The rituals, while often drawing on Celtic symbolism, are modern creations designed to be meaningful for people living in a world the ancient Druids could never have conceived. This creative synthesis makes modern Druidry part of a broader movement known as modern paganism or neo-paganism, which includes other revived traditions like Wicca and Asatru. What often distinguishes Druidry within this family is its particularly strong emphasis on the philosophical and scholarly. While it certainly has its mystical and ritualistic dimensions, there is a strong current that encourages the study of archaeology, Celtic history, comparative mythology, and natural science, seeing this intellectual pursuit as a form of devotion in itself. It is a spirituality that does not ask you to check your brain at the door, but rather to engage it fully in the great work of understanding your place in the cosmos. The ultimate goal is not to escape the world, but to become more fully immersed in it, to develop a relationship with nature, community, and self that is rooted in awe, responsibility, and a profound sense of belonging. In this way, the modern Druid stands as a living bridge honoring the whispers of an ancient past while speaking to the urgent spiritual hungers of the present, proving that the quest for meaning that once animated the sacred groves is a human impulse that continues to find new and vital forms of expression. The stones themselves are now beginning to speak, not through myth or legend, but through the precise, unassailable language of mathematics and light. Modern archaeoastronomy, the science of how ancient cultures understood and related to celestial phenomena, has armed researchers with tools that are finally capable of decoding the silent genius embedded within these monuments. We are moving beyond speculation into the realm of demonstrable, repeatable observation, and what we are discovering is forcing a complete reappraisal of the intellectual landscape of prehistoric Europe. This isn't about proving that ancient people were primitive astronomers. It's about revealing that they were master cosmologists whose architectural achievements reveal a depth of knowledge we are only just beginning to fathom. At the forefront of this revelation stands Newgrange, a site that predates both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid of Giza. For most of the year, this massive kidney-shaped mound in Ireland's Boyne Valley is a silent, imposing structure. But for a few precious minutes around the winter solstice, something miraculous happens. A single, narrow beam of sunlight pierces a specially engineered opening known as a roof box, located directly above the main entrance. This sliver of light then travels down a 60-foot-long, narrow passageway, gradually illuminating the floor until it dramatically floods the central cross-shaped chamber with a golden glow, perfectly illuminating intricate spiral carvings on the back wall. This event is not a happy accident. The roof box is a feat of precise engineering, a stone-framed window designed with a clear and singular purpose to capture the rising sun on the shortest days of the year. The alignment is so exact that it only functions for a brief period around the solstice, with the peak illumination occurring for just 17 minutes at dawn over a span of about 5 days. To achieve this, the builders needed not only generations of meticulous solar observation, but also an advanced understanding of geometry and structural engineering to orient the entire 60-ton, multi-chambered cairn with such breathtaking accuracy. This was a civilization that planned, designed, and executed a project meant to function for millennia, a permanent testament to their belief in the cycle of death and rebirth, capturing the first light of the reborn sun in the deepest heart of a tomb. Stonehenge, while later and structurally different, reveals a similar, though even more complex, celestial ambition. For centuries, the summer solstice alignment, where the sun rises over the heel stone to shine into the center of the circle, has been its most famous astronomical feature. But modern laser surveys and digital analysis have uncovered a far richer tapestry of alignments woven into the monument's phases of construction. It appears that Stonehenge was not just a solar calendar, but also a sophisticated lunar observatory. The arrangement of the iconic sarsen stones, particularly the 4 station stones that form a rectangle, creates precise sightlines to the extreme rising and setting points of the moon during its major standstill, an intricate 18.6-year cycle. This lunar cycle was of profound importance, likely connected to rituals, timekeeping, and myths that are now lost to us. The recent discovery of the nearby Durrington Walls settlement, which appears to be aligned with the winter solstice sunset, suggests that the entire landscape around Stonehenge was a vast, integrated ritual complex with different sites marking different celestial events throughout the year. The journey of the sun and moon were not abstract concepts. They were the central characters in a cosmic drama played out across the Salisbury Plain, with Stonehenge serving as the grand stage. This emerging picture fundamentally changes our understanding of the Druids' relationship to these sites. They did not build Stonehenge or Newgrange. The monuments were already ancient, often thousands of years old, by the time the Celtic culture and its Druidic class emerged. Rather than being the original architects, the Druids were far more likely the inheritors and curators of this sacred geography. They were the ones who, centuries or even millennia later, recognized the profound power and knowledge encoded in these structures and incorporated them into their own spiritual and intellectual framework. A Druid standing at Newgrange would have understood the immense cosmological significance of the winter solstice illumination, seeing it not just as a solar event, but as a powerful symbol of their own belief in the immortality of the soul and the perpetual cycle of life, death, and rebirth. They would have been the learned caste who preserved the oral traditions that explained why these places were sacred, interpreting the alignments within their own philosophical system. Their role was to be the living librarians of a knowledge system written in stone and sky by a much older civilization, maintaining the rituals and understanding that gave these ancient monuments their enduring power and meaning. The scope of this pre-Celtic knowledge is expanding with every new archaeological season. Beyond the famous examples, sites across the British Isles and Europe reveal a widespread and sophisticated understanding of the heavens. In Scotland, the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire are consistently aligned with the southern moon, their largest stone laid horizontally, framing the lunar orb as it skims the horizon. In Portugal, the Almendar's cromlech shows evidence of alignments with both the equinoxes and the star Aldebaran. In the Orkney Islands, the Ness of Brodgar, a vast Neolithic ritual complex, is revealing structures with solstitial alignments that are pushing the timeline of sophisticated astronomy in Britain back even further. What is becoming undeniably clear is that the lost knowledge we associate with the Druids has roots that plunge deep into the Neolithic era. The intellectual tradition of these islands is not 2,500 years old, it is more than 5,000 years old. The people who built these monuments were not simple farmers. They were part of a complex, coordinated culture capable of large-scale engineering projects, precise long-term astronomical observation, and the transmission of this knowledge across generations without a written language. This pushes the timeline of lost knowledge back by millennia, suggesting a continuous thread of celestial understanding that was passed down, adapted, and preserved, eventually finding its way into the hands of the Druids, who became its final and most famous custodians before the Roman conquest sought to sever the chain forever. This profound reverence for a sacred plant, so central to the Druidic worldview, finds a startling and beautiful echo in the heart of classical mythology, inviting us to look for a deeper, shared ancestry. When we place the image of the Druid, clad in white and harvesting mistletoe with a golden sickle from the celestial oak, beside the story of the golden bough from Virgil's Aeneid, the parallels are too striking to ignore. In Virgil's epic, the Trojan hero Aeneas must journey to the underworld to speak with his deceased father. The Sibyl, his guide, tells him he cannot enter the land of the dead unless he first plucks a magical golden bough, a glistening metallic branch that grows deep within a shadowy forest clinging to a specific tree. Just like the Druidic mistletoe, this bough is not found on just any tree. It is a divine exception to the laws of nature, a gift from the gods. It too must be harvested correctly. If Aeneas is the destined one, the bough will come away easily in his hand. If not, no amount of force can break it. This is a direct narrative parallel to the precise ritual prescribed for the Druids, where the plant must be cut at the perfect celestial moment and caught before it touches the ground. Both the mistletoe and the golden bough are botanical keys, tangible objects of power that grant safe passage between the worlds of the living and the dead. For the Druids, the mistletoe was the all-heal, a substance of life and protection harvested from a tree associated with the sky gods. For Aeneas, the golden bough is his passport through the realm of death, a gift for the queen of the underworld that ensures his safe return. This is not mere coincidence. It suggests a common mythological root, a shared Indo-European concept of a liminal plant, suspended between heaven and earth, that holds the power to mediate between life and death, the mortal and the divine. This kinship of ideas extends beyond sacred botany and into the very geography of the afterlife. The Celtic otherworld, whether called Tir na an Og or Anon, bears a remarkable resemblance to the Greek concept of the Elysian Fields. Both are paradisiacal realms reserved not for everyone, but for the heroic, the virtuous, and the favored of the gods. The Celtic otherworld is a land of perpetual youth where time stands still, feasting is endless, and joy is the only reality. It is often described as a series of islands across the Western Sea, bathed in an eternal, gentle light. The Greek Elysian Fields, as described by poets like Homer and Pindar, is a virtually identical concept, a peaceful, blissful plain at the farthest edge of the world where the air is always fresh, and heroes who have found favor with the gods enjoy a painless, perfect existence. There is no snow, no cold, and no toil, only the gentle breezes of the oceanous river. In both traditions, this blessed afterlife is not a passive state of rest, but an active social existence. In Tir na an Og, the heroes engage in friendly athletic contests, feast, and listen to enchanting music. In Elysium, the souls of the righteous pursue the pastimes they loved in life, like chariot racing and wrestling. This stands in stark contrast to the gloomy, shadowy underworld of Hades for the common Greek soul, and the potentially grim aspects of the Celtic otherworld for those not deemed worthy. Both cultures clearly envisioned a tiered afterlife, where a select few could escape the grim fate of the masses and attain a state of idealized, vibrant immortality. This shared vision of a heroic paradise points toward a common ancestral belief system that was carried across Europe, evolving in isolation but retaining its core structure. These powerful similarities in both ritual and cosmology are not random. They are likely the cultural fingerprints of a much older, shared heritage. Linguists and mythologists have long identified the existence of the Proto-Indo-European people, a prehistoric population from the Pontic-Caspian steppe who, over thousands of years, migrated across Europe and parts of Asia, spreading their language and their foundational myths. As these groups diverged, settling in places as far apart as the British Isles, the Italian peninsula, and the Greek archipelago, their languages evolved into the Celtic Italic, which includes Latin and Hellenic families. Their core spiritual concepts evolved as well, adapting to new environments and new political realities, but the underlying architecture often remained. The sacred, life-giving plant that grants access to the otherworld is one such archetype. The concept of a tripartite universe, an underworld, a middle earth, and a sky realm, is another found in the Celtic land, sea and sky, as well as in the Greek Hades, earth and Olympus. The role of a powerful priestly or poetic class like the Druids, the Roman Flamines, and the Greek oracles further underscores this shared social and spiritual framework. Yet for all these profound connections, the divergences are just as telling, revealing how cultures molded these inherited ideas to fit their unique worldview. The most significant difference lies in the relationship between humanity and the divine landscape. In the Greco-Roman tradition, the golden bough is a singular, miraculous object, a plot device for a single epic hero on a divinely mandated quest. It is an exception to the natural order, a one-of-a-kind key for a unique journey. For the Druids, however, the mistletoe was not a singular miracle but a recurring, cyclical phenomenon. It appeared on many oak trees, and its harvest was an annual or periodic ritual performed for the benefit of the entire community, not just for one individual. This distinction is crucial. It reflects the Roman focus on the singular, heroic destiny of the state and its founders, embodied by Aeneas, whose personal quest leads to the founding of Rome. The Druidic practice, by contrast, reflects a communal, ecological spirituality, where the renewal of life and the favor of the gods was a collective concern, tied to the health of the land and the entire tribe. Similarly, while both the Elysian Fields and Tir Na and Og are paradises, access to them is governed by different principles. Elysium was primarily for those related to the gods or heroes of immense renown, a reward for individual glory and divine favor. The Celtic otherworld, while certainly welcoming heroes, was also accessible through invitation, fairy mischief, or accidental passage, suggesting a more permeable and less strictly merit-based boundary between the worlds. This speaks to a culture where the otherworld was a more integrated, ever-present part of reality, not a distant reward for a select few. These comparisons do not diminish either tradition. Instead, they enrich our understanding, showing us how a shared ancestral root could branch out into the mighty oak of Druidic natural philosophy and the cultivated olive tree of classical myth, each magnificent in its own right, but both reaching back to the same deep, ancient soil. Imagine for a moment that the Druids had chosen a different path. What if, instead of guarding their wisdom in the sacred vault of memory, they had committed their entire intellectual inheritance to parchment and stone? Picture great libraries, not of Alexandria, but of Gaul and Britain, hidden within oak groves or carved into the walls of sacred mounds, filled with thousands of volumes detailing the secrets they held so close. The sudden, violent suppression by Rome would have been a catastrophe, but it would not have been a total erasure. Charred fragments might have survived. Buried hoards of inscribed lead tablets could have been unearthed by farmers centuries later, and copies might have found their way to the remote, untouchable corners of the world. We would not be piecing together a phantom from biased accounts and enigmatic stones. We would be reading their words in their own voice, a direct line to a lost way of thinking. The sheer scale of what was lost is almost impossible to overstate. We would possess the complete and sophisticated legal system of the Celts, the Brehon laws, not as they were later recorded by Christian monks who had already altered them, but in their original pagan form. We would understand the precise philosophical justifications for their judgments, the intricate relationship between an individual's honor price and their role in the tribe, and the true meaning behind their complex rituals of kingship and sovereignty. Their astronomical knowledge, hinted at by the Coligny Calendar, would be laid out in full. Instead of merely knowing they tracked a 30-year lunisolar cycle, we might possess their theoretical models for predicting eclipses, their detailed star charts mapping the constellations as they saw them, and their mythological interpretations of the celestial bodies, revealing a complete cosmology that wove together the movements of the heavens with the moral laws of the earth. The Druids were said to have taught for 20 years. That is a curriculum rivaling any modern university. The Lost Library would contain their entire syllabus texts on advanced geometry used to lay out stone circles, poetic compositions encoding historical events, and medical treatises detailing the pharmacological properties of hundreds of native plants, possibly including cures for diseases we still struggle with today, all framed within their holistic understanding of the body, spirit, environment as a single, interconnected system. Consider the direct impact on our understanding of European prehistory. The megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and Newgrange would no longer be silent. We could raid the Druids' own explanations for why these sites were built, the specific rituals performed there, and the names and stories of the gods and ancestors to whom they were dedicated. The enigmatic symbols carved into stones across the Celtic world would be deciphered, transforming from abstract art into a legible theological and historical text. We would know the true story of the great migrations, the founding of tribes, and the biographies of legendary heroes and chieftains, free from the later edits of myth-makers. The Roman accounts, which are our primary window into this world, would be relegated to a secondary source, a fascinating but biased counterpoint to the authentic native narrative. We could finally answer the questions that have haunted historians for centuries. How widespread was human sacrifice, and what was its true spiritual context? What was the full extent of their trade and diplomatic connections with the Mediterranean world? How did their philosophy of the soul's immortality actually influence daily life and social structure? The fog that has shrouded ancient Europe for 2 millennia would lift, revealing a landscape teeming with intellectual vibrancy and cultural complexity. This vanished library would represent more than just a collection of facts. It would be a testament to a fundamentally different way of engaging with reality. Modern science, for all its power, often operates by dissecting the world, breaking it down into its constituent parts to understand how it works. The Druidic tradition, as best we can tell, seemed to approach knowledge through synthesis, seeking to understand how everything was connected. Their wisdom was not divided into separate, specialized departments of biology, astronomy, and law. For them, the law was derived from the observed order of the cosmos, medicine was guided by the spirits of the land, and poetry held the power to shape reality itself. To read their texts would be to access a unified theory of existence, one where spirit and matter, humanity and nature, were not in opposition but were participants in a single, sacred and animate whole. It would challenge the very foundations of Western thought, offering an alternative intellectual heritage that prioritized harmony with the natural world over its domination. In the end, this grand what-if is more than a historical exercise. It is a poignant reminder of the fragility of human knowledge. The Druids chose an oral tradition to keep their wisdom alive and powerful, believing it was too potent to be frozen on a page. The tragic irony is that this very decision made it uniquely vulnerable to extinction. A written text can be burned, but it can also be hidden, copied, and rediscovered. A living voice once silenced is gone forever. The loss of the Druids' library is one of the great intellectual catastrophes of the ancient world, a black hole in our collective memory whose gravitational pull we can still feel today. We are left with the haunting echo of their presence, a profound sense of a conversation cut short just as we were leaning in to listen, forever wondering about the depths of understanding that vanished when the last Druid, the last living library, took his final breath. Look closely at the landscape of modern imagination, and you will find the ghost of the Druid staring back at you, not from a history book, but from the pages of our most beloved stories and the very names of our towns and rivers. This enduring legacy is perhaps nowhere more vividly personified than in the figure of Merlin, the great wizard of Arthurian legend. He is not a medieval invention sprung wholly from a Christian scribe's pen, but rather he is the direct literary descendant of the Druidic archetype, reimagined for a new age. Consider his classic portrayal, a wild man of the forest living in a domain of ancient trees, possessing a deep, prophetic knowledge of the natural world and the future. He is a shapeshifter, a master of illusion, and the supreme advisor to a king whose legitimacy he helps to secure, a role that mirrors the historical Druids' function as the power behind the throne, the one who understood the sacred rites of sovereignty. His very name, in some Welsh traditions, connects him to the wild, a creature of the borderlands between the human world and the untamed spirit of the land, much like the Druids who mediated between the tribe and the other world. The Christian writers who recorded the Arthurian cycles were grappling with a powerful pagan past they could not simply erase, so they transformed it. They sanitized the Druid, stripping away the potential for human sacrifice and reframing his magical power as a mysterious gift, sometimes even a dangerous one, but ultimately placing it in the service of a Christian kingdom. Merlin is the Druid baptized by literature, a testament to how deeply the archetype of the wild, all-knowing sage was etched into the cultural consciousness of Britain. This cultural echo extends far beyond a single legendary wizard and permeates the very soil beneath our feet through the language of place names. Across the British Isles and France, the map is a palimpsest of the old Celtic world, written over but never fully erased. Every time you visit a town whose name ends in Don or Dun, like London or Dunedin, you are speaking a word derived from the Celtic Dunon, meaning a hill fort or a fortified settlement, the very seats of tribal power where Druids would have advised chieftains. Rivers, those sacred conduits to the other world, often retain the names of the goddesses the Druids venerated. The River Severn in England takes its name from the goddess Sabrina, a divine spirit of the waters. The River Marne in France flows from the name of the mother goddess Matrona. The River Boyne in Ireland, beside which the great tomb of Newgrange sits, is named for the goddess Bone. These are not just pretty names, they are enduring prayers, the lingering signature of a worldview that saw the landscape as alive with divine presence. Even the name of the Danube, one of Europe's great rivers, is thought to derive from the goddess Danu, a primordial mother figure in Celtic and other Indo-European traditions. To travel through these regions is to move through a sacred geography where the old gods, once consulted by the Druids, have been immortalized in the everyday language of direction and location, their power sublimated into the geography itself. This persistence continues in the rich and complex tapestry of European folklore, where the old beliefs were not so much abandoned as they were domesticated, transforming the great gods into the hidden folk of the hills and hollows. The powerful deities of the Tuatha De Danann, whom the Druids served, did not vanish with the coming of Christianity. Instead, they retreated, diminishing in stature but not in potency, becoming the Aos Shi, the people of the mounds, or what we commonly call the fairies. The fairy lore of the British Isles is not the whimsical, tiny-winged creature of Victorian nursery tales. It is the direct cultural memory of the Celtic otherworld and its inhabitants, a memory the Druids were tasked with managing. These fairies are capricious, powerful, and territorial. They live in the Shia mounds, the very same ancient burial tumuli that were considered gateways to the otherworld. They can bring blessings or blight, and they demand respect. The common folk practices of leaving out a saucer of milk, avoiding building on a fairy path, or refusing to cut down a lone hawthorn tree are not random superstitions. They are the surviving fragments of the ancient pacts and protocols that the Druids once oversaw, a system of community-wide etiquette designed to maintain a peaceful and balanced relationship with the powerful, invisible co-inhabitants of the land. The fear of a fairy curse that could sour milk, sicken cattle, or bring misfortune is a folk memory of the immense spiritual power these beings were believed to wield, a power that the Druids alone were thought to be able to influence or appease through formal ritual. The most resilient traditions often surround specific, liminal times of the year, and here again, the Druidic worldview proves its staying power. The Great Fire Festival of Samhain, celebrated from October 31st into November 1st, was one of the most important dates in the Druidic calendar. It marked the end of the old year and the beginning of the new, a time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits was believed to be at its absolute thinnest. The Druids would have overseen the sacred bonfires, the feasts for the dead, and the rituals of divination that sought to glimpse the future in this uncanny in-between time. Look at our modern Halloween, and you will see the clear, if commercialized, shadow of this ancient festival. The tradition of dressing in costumes finds its roots in the belief that one needed to disguise oneself from, or perhaps placate, the spirits and fairies that were freely roaming the earth. The custom of carving turnips and later pumpkins into grotesque faces may harken back to the creation of protective talismans to ward off malevolent entities. The practice of going door to door for food or offerings echoes the ancient custom of collecting resources for the communal Samhain feast. While the overt religious meaning has faded, the underlying psychological structure, a recognition of this time as a potent, eerie, and spiritually charged threshold remains firmly in place, a direct inheritance from the Celtic world the Druids helped to shape. This profound cultural absorption suggests that the Druids' most significant legacy may not be a specific piece of lost knowledge, but the enduring framework of a particular kind of imagination. They cultivated a worldview that was inherently poetic, symbolic, and deeply connected to the living earth, and this framework was woven so tightly into the fabric of Celtic life that it could not be ripped out, only rewoven into new patterns. Long after their political power was broken and their groves were cut down, their way of seeing persisted in the stories told by the fireside, in the names given to the landmarks of a farmer's daily life, and in the unshakable feeling that certain places, a lone tree, a quiet spring, a weathered stone, held a presence that demanded a moment of silence and respect. It is an imagination that finds mystery in the mundane and sees the landscape as a text to be read, full of signs, portents, and stories. This is the subtle, indelible mark they left on the European psyche, a foundational layer of our cultural heritage that continues to influence our art, our literature, and our ingrained, often unconscious, relationship with the natural world. The Druids may have been silenced as a formal institution, but the imaginative world they championed, a world alive with spirit and meaning, never truly died. It simply went to ground, resurfacing in the enduring power of story, name, and tradition, waiting for us to recognize its ancient roots. And so our journey through the mists of time comes to a close, a voyage that has taken us from the sacred oak groves of ancient Gaul to the quiet meditations of the modern Druid revival. We began with a haunting question whispered across 2,000 years. What profound knowledge vanished when the last Druid took his final breath? We have walked in their footsteps, exploring the roles they played as judges, healers, astronomers, and poets, the very intellectual engine of a vibrant Celtic civilization. We've seen how their entire world was a living scripture, from the Ogham alphabet etched in tree lore to the celestial clockwork of the Coligny Calendar, and from the sacred geometry of stone circles to the powerful symbolism of the mistletoe and the golden sickle. We have grappled with the challenging aspects of their culture, from the potent social force of a bard's satire to the profound, if unsettling, veneration of the human head, all within a cosmology where the land, sea, and sky were in constant, sacred conversation. The great and poignant truth we are left with is that the complete, unbroken ancient code of the Druids is, in all likelihood, lost to us forever. The Roman campaign of suppression, culminating in the massacre on the Isle of Mona, successfully shattered the organized oral tradition that had been carefully cultivated for generations. The living library of their memory was silenced. Yet, as we have discovered, the echo of their wisdom was far too powerful to be entirely extinguished. It did not vanish, but instead fragmented and seeped into the very bedrock of our culture. We find its shards in the illuminated pages of the Book of Kells, where Christian monks preserved the intricate, swirling art of their ancestors. We hear its whispers in the fairy lore of the British Isles, where the old gods retreated into the Shia mounds as the owls she. We see its legacy in the map of Europe itself, where rivers still bear the names of forgotten goddesses and towns are built upon the foundations of ancient Dunans. What endures is not a rigid doctrine, but a powerful and timeless perspective, a way of seeing the world as an interconnected, animate whole, where humanity is not a master over nature, but a participant within a sacred web of life. The Druids' reverence for the oak and the wellspring finds a deep resonance in our modern ecological consciousness. Their pursuit of wisdom through the study of the stars and the properties of plants speaks to our own scientific curiosity. Their belief in the power of poetry and story to shape reality and enforce justice reminds us of the enduring force of art and truth. The modern Druid revival, in its thoughtful and creative way, is not pretending to resurrect a dead religion, but is rather reaching for the essence of this worldview, seeking to re-enchant our relationship with the earth and our own inner lives. The journey to understand the Druids, then, is more than a historical puzzle. It is an invitation to look at our own world with a little more wonder, to listen for the stories whispered on the wind, and to recognize that the pursuit of knowledge, the love of the land, and the quest for meaning are threads in a human tapestry that stretches back into the deepest reaches of time. Now we turn this mystery over to you. As you walk through your own local landscape, do you sense places that feel different, charged with a kind of quiet energy? Have you grown up with family stories or local folklore that might hold faint, fascinating echoes of this ancient knowledge? Tales of fairy rings, sacred wells, or trees that were never to be cut down. The fragments of the Druidic world are scattered all around us, waiting in plain sight for those who know how to look. Share your own thoughts, stories, and discoveries in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation and see what other pieces of the puzzle we can uncover together. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the heart of a historical enigma, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the lost worlds and forgotten secrets of our past.